Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, we invite you to listen to part 5 of the series. Chapter 38, Tough. What happened if a launcher spat out its entire complement of rockets at once? Something really fantastic and terrible, depending on who you asked. Miranda immediately became aware of the crisis and proved her chops as a young elite by throwing her sword forward while huddling behind her shield with both of her mech's hands, making sure to crouch to present as small of a profile as possible. The sword knocked a couple of rockets aside. Due to the safeties built into the warheads, they failed to detonate early due to their close proximity to the launcher. Instead, they flew or fell to the floor largely inert. As for the other rockets, the upper portion harmlessly flew past the crouching mech while the lower portion exploded harshly against the shield. Due to the decrease in lethality among all projectiles, the rockets failed to penetrate the shield, though they did cause quite a few layers to peel off. The force of the explosions also rocked Miranda's mech backwards. I've got more where that came from. Charlotte taunted as her heavy mech turned another 45 degrees so that her Kirby's back faced her opponent at a straight angle. Miranda got cut off as another volley of missiles came in her direction. She tried to do a roll while keeping her shield forward. This successfully let her avoid most of the rocket barrage, though the lower corner of her shield finally fell apart from the few projectiles that managed to hit it with sufficient force. Before Miranda could celebrate her survival, Charlotte's final launcher disgorged its payload. Umoth dash. The feminine mech finally escaped the last wave with the skin of its teeth. The few rockets that detonated against its armor managed to crater a portion of the chest. It's checkmate for you, Charlotte gloatingly said as she kept turning slowly, allowing her to present her outstretched cannon and laser mount. The weapons at that side spat out a furious salvo that further damaged the bedraggled Miranda and her mech. Damn it, if it wasn't for those stupid rockets, I'd have peeled your limbs off by now. Ever since Miranda dodged further away in order to escape the rockets, she lost the initiative. Her mech needed time to build up speed, and before she built up her momentum, Charlotte got a prime opportunity to sneak in a lot of damage. The Kirby sinisterly aimed at the legs, hoping to impair Miranda's mobility. A lucky high-explosive cannon shell managed to detonate close to the legs, which stripped off the rest of the armor of the female mech's feet. The force of the small explosion also unbalanced Miranda's gait, causing her to lose crucial speed. Alright, I wanted to save this for the finals, but you leave me no choice now. Let me show you what Patricia gifted my mech. VES bit his lip as Miranda finally took the match seriously. He knew that Miranda always kept something in reserve, as a mech designer as renowned as Patricia wouldn't just let her partner go out in a boring stock mech. The female mech's back armor opened up to reveal a stubby flight system. VES almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. That fucking Patricia stole my design. Patricia not only stole his idea, she improved upon it. She expanded and sloped the back armor in a way that freed up space while not making it obvious a miniature flight system was attached in that location. The amount of engineering it took to create such a hidden surprise boggled V's mind. He had to admit that Patricia possessed terrifying competence. Miranda's mech ceased to care for its damaged legs as the compact flight system allowed it to travel above the floor with sufficient speed. The light mech's ability to dodge improved substantially. After building up sufficient speed, it flew towards the Kirby for a second showdown. Charlotte gritted her teeth inside the cockpit. Her rear armor was burdened with empty rocket launchers. Though they already released their payloads, they still weighed her down a little bit. In addition, she sacrificed one of her shoulder mounts in order to fend off Miranda. With only one laser mount left, she was sorely pressed to keep off the looming threat. The match entered another act, and this time even if Miranda had thrown aside her sword, she still possessed enough lethality once she unsheathed her backup knife. Yet it never came to use, as Charlotte finally achieved a critical hit to the light mech's weapon arm. Miranda managed to swap the knife to her mech's other arm, but the damage it suffered when holding the shield caused the fingers to grip the knife unsteadily. The distraction allowed Charlotte to get in another couple of shots. When her next cannon shell impacted the light mech again, the competition's inbuilt safeties kicked in and turned the projectile inert. Everyone was silent for a moment, then cheered massively as they experienced an upset. The number 2 favorite of the Fusion Cup surprisingly lost to the 6th-ranked contenders. Charlotte whooped through the microphones even as the people rooting for the other side stood silently, as if still not believing this was happening. Both pilots exited the cockpits while technicians lifted the damaged mechs back to their workshops. 2 pilots and 2 mech designers met in the middle of the arena to congratulate each other and shake hands. Smugness overwhelmed Charlotte's grin as she beheld her defeated rival. It was a good match. I got lucky. Miranda snorted at that. They should penalize heavy mechs even more in these bullshit tournaments. Your mech weighs at least 3 to 4 times as much as mine. Well, the rules don't say you can't bring one too. You're welcome to join the heavy club. We got the fattest asses around. The defeated pilot just huffed in reply. As the 2 pilots talked smack, VES hesitantly shook hands with Patricia. Her gentle smile and soft, small hand mesmerized him for a moment. Being this close to her amplified the effect of her striking red locks and her lovely dimples. You did a really great job with integrating the flight system to the chassis. It's a lot better than welding a couple of boxes to the armor like I did. If my mech partner hadn't achieved a lucky hit at the end, then this contest might end differently. Patricia shook her head. Don't belittle yourself. What you chose to augment worked out much better in the end. You chose to plug a gap while I doubled down on Miranda's strength. I don't think either choices are wrong, but as you said, it worked out better for you as the extra firepower was a lot more useful than flight capability in our matchup. To be honest, both Miranda and I expected to fight a medium or light mech. Yours is the only heavy mech in contention. The 2 babbled a bit about the design choices they made for their respective mechs. What actually VES had in mind was trying to facilitate the X Factor, but that was something of a secret weapon to him. He instead diverted Patricia's attention by pointing out he had a hard time convincing Charlotte of making any changes. She only approved the rockets due to agreeing with her affinity for more weapons. Miranda gave me the lead instead. Patricia explained. As a gifted pilot, she's proficient in piloting many variations of light mechs, so when I proposed to adapt your flying system scheme to her mech, she readily agreed. Now that I think about it, I should have involved my partner more in the shaping of her mech. The 2 teams parted after the announcers called in the next contestants. Charlotte and VES returned to the workshop where the beat-up Kirby rested. While Miranda ultimately inflicted no damage, Charlotte caused enough of it to compensate. The mech's left shoulder was absent a laser mount, and the entire mech still suffered minor internal damage due to overheating. An overheating mech posed serious problems in terms of repairing them. A mech that ran as hot as an oven all over meant that the damaging heat penetrated to the very deepest interior of the mech. To repair such a mech to maximum readiness, VES was required to pull the mech apart and go over each component one by one. Thin wires and small components were especially vulnerable to damage from excessive local heat. It'll last. It's not the first time I cooked the Kirby. He's built to take a pounding. Charlotte nonchalantly declared as she sank down in a nearby sofa and sipped her energy drink. VES sighed in exasperation. We only have about an hour to 2 hours before we're called up on the stage again. That's barely enough to refill the rocket launchers and roughly slap another laser mount on the Kirby's empty shoulder. I don't have the time to do the repairs I'm certain this mech needs. Then don't. I'll just roll with the punches. If my Kirby's a little slow, it's no big deal. I'm already used to moving at a snail's pace. VES really preferred not to hand his chances of winning over to fate. Their stunning upset against Patricia and Miranda attracted some attention from the crowd, but most of them attributed their win to a faulty strategy by their opponents. Winning a match by getting lucky didn't prove his mech designing skills. If Charlotte and VES somehow managed to scrounge up another win in the next match, they could prove that they possessed real skill. If VES sufficiently proved his capabilities, then he'd have a much easier time selling off his own mech. He still kept his ultimate goal in mind. Winning the Fusion Cup was not a life or death matter. It only helped fulfill his other goals. He got on with the repairs while keeping an eye out for how his competitors were doing. Most of them involved high-speed duels or tense battles where both sides clashed their swords against each other. This excited the crowd much more than the one-sided shooting fest Charlotte went through in the previous match. Refilling the empty rocket launchers took very little effort. It only took a little time because the machines available to VES could only put in one rocket in its tube at a time. After that, VES dug into the pile of spare parts the competition offered and picked the closest-looking equivalent of the Turbofire's standard laser mount. Removing the damaged remains from Charlotte's emergency dismounting of the shoulder mount was a delicate operation. If VES screwed up here, the new laser mount wouldn't fit in the standardized socket, which enabled the laser mount to link into the mech's targeting systems and draw power for its rotation. Luckily, the mech appeared to have been built for these kinds of actions, as VES encountered no bumps into making the socket clean. After carefully attaching the laser mount, VES spent some time making sure the mech's processors correctly adjusted its targeting system to the new mount. Different models required different parameters in order to fire accurately. It didn't perform as well as the original model, but for a quick fix it did the job. VES swept the moisture from his forehead as he finished the essential repairs. Barring the damage the mech previously suffered before its entry in the Fusion Cup, the Kirby recovered its highest combat state. In the meantime, a couple of other matches took place in the arena. Mechs sporting different amounts of damage and variation entered the stage and duked it out with their counterparts. What VES paid the most attention to was the match that decided his next opponent. The match progressed in a one-sided fashion. A hapless knight who ranked 8th in the previous tournament was forced to use his backup pistol against a skirmisher-type mech. The skirmisher wielded 2 submachine guns and ran circles around the mech with ruthless patience. "Looks like that SMG fellow will be my next opponent," Charlotte remarked as she already sized up her next likely opponent. "I hope my armor will be up to the task." The skirmisher fell under the medium weight class but moved almost like a light mech. VES checked the names of the participants and learned the skirmisher's pilot was called Alexander Steele. His mech designer was a fellow named Michael Dumont, who studied at a private institution based in a second-rate state. This guy looks tricky. Unlike Patricia, who merely mastered the basics to the utmost level, Michael is more familiar with new advancements and better techniques. I think Alexander is holding back the full potential of his mech. His current opponent isn't worth exposing his trump card. Charlotte's easy smile turned into a serious frown. She had reason to worry if Alexander's skirmisher possessed a hidden card. Normally, heavy gunners easily shredded skirmishers solely due to the difference in firepower and armor, but what if the skirmisher changed his weapon loadout? The submachine guns work great against knights because they can't catch up to you and don't possess enough firepower to compete at range. But that's obviously not going to work for you, Charlotte. She nodded at that realization. Unlike her own mech whose weapons were pretty much fixed, Alexander could just put down the SMGs and take a more appropriate weapon into battle, such as a heavy shield or an armor-piercing rifle. This flexibility was an intrinsic advantage all humanoid mechs with functional arms enjoyed. VES paid attention to Alexander's mech. With his previous experience in optimizing the armor for the Caesar Augustus and Mark Antony, he recognized the mech battling it out in the arena followed a completely different design philosophy. It looked lean, sleek, and aerodynamic, as if it wanted to pursue speed much harder than a light mech. And in a major sense it mostly achieved such a result at the cost of limiting its onboard loadout of weapons. The mech lacked any indications of possessing wrist, shoulder, or back-mounted weapon platforms. By the time Alexander achieved victory over his humiliated opponent, VES knew he had very little time left to make some last-minute changes. Should he improve the Kirby's targeting system? Perhaps add a couple more armor plates to increase its bulk. He disliked falling into this guessing game. Every decision was plagued with an indeterminate fog. Did a choice lead to riches or ruin? Stop procrastinating, VES. You're not even going on stage, yet you're sweating bullets. After taking a deep breath, VES regained much of his composure. You're right. With the time we have left, I doubt I can make any substantial changes to your loadout. I'm going to work on refining the Kirby. I didn't say anything about keeping my Kirby bare bones. You've done right by Kirby, and I appreciate it. You mech designer types aren't as stuffy and close-minded as everyone says you guys are. You're cool. Thanks. So what's your idea? Charlotte recovered her cheer and grinned deviously at him. Seeing as I'm going to face another speedy type, I'd like you to make the following tweaks. Chapter 39, Luck or Skill. When VES sent off the newly repaired and modified Kirby, his expression was mixed. The modification Charlotte suggested changed the Kirby in a way that hopefully would come as an unwelcome surprise to Alexander Steele. Michael Dumont must be thinking the same thing. The low-key fourth-ranked mech designer from the qualifications hadn't raised eyebrows like Patricia or Edwin, but he possessed real capabilities to make it this far. The skirmisher's smooth and practically undamaged form was a testament to his repair skills. The Kirby's heavy, burdened form stepped forward into the arena yet again. Its steps echoed the quiet arena as it beheld its opponent. The medium mech looked as spotless as ever, though it exchanged its twin submachine guns for double kite shields. Damn, this is ridiculous. VES muttered to himself as his eyes widened at the ridiculous loadout. It wasn't unheard of for mechs to bring double shields to the battlefield. Two shields offered a great amount of protection against ranged damage. Knight-type mechs holding a defensive position often made for great defenders for their more vulnerable comrades if they carried two shields for maximum cover. Some savvy manufacturers even got in on the action by selling purpose-built tower shields that weighed like a brick but could withstand incredible punishment. That was why the notion that Alexander carried a pair of heavy shields for his swift and agile mech sounded ridiculous. Why give up his advantage in mobility to gain an average amount of durability? The shields may prove useful against the Kirby's guns, but their weight turned the skirmisher into a sitting duck, allowing Charlotte to pound Alexander into a pulp before he'd even reach his enemy. Could it be that Alexander is carrying another weapon? The timer counted down. Plenty of people in the audience took note of this match. Not only did it determine which team entered the finals, it also signified a battle between two unusually modified mechs. The crowd was beginning to come around to the idea behind the Fusion Cup. It not only tested a pilot's judgment and skill, it also involved his partner's craftiness. The mech designer's role might not be as flashy as the pilot's, but his every move affected the battlefield in a way that was no less influential. VES feared Michael quite a bit for this reason. The men hid his competence well, for the skirmisher that he fixed up revealed no hints of what lurked beneath its spotless facade. 3, 2, 1, start. The match exploded into action as Charlotte fired all her guns without waiting to engage her targeting systems. Her manual aim proved sufficient as pretty much both of its explosive shells detonated squarely against the skirmisher's shields. Surprisingly, the shield held against the immense assaults. The lasers fired from the Kirby's shoulders merely splashed the shield's surface with ineffectual heat. The second volley of shells from the Kirby's arm cannons failed to deal any substantial damage to the sturdy shields. The skirmisher calmly stepped forward, leaning its posture square against the shields just before Charlotte fired. While the shields contributed much to the skirmisher's unyielding pace, Alexander's impeccable piloting skill made sure his mech maintained its balance. How can this? I don't even. VES tried to parse the sight in front of him. The shields were able to withstand incredible punishment far beyond the materials provided by the organizers should be able to withstand. Are they cheating? In front of a crowd of millions? Likely not. Such blatant rule-breaking threw away all credibility for the young Tiger's exhibition. Then, considering all the state-of-the-art machinery the mech designers had at their disposal, then Michael must have treated an existing pair of shields with a highly advanced composition so far ahead that it must involve some secrets from a second-rate state. He grimaced at the guess. The organizers were probably overjoyed when they get to peek over Michael's shoulders. The technique he used might not be known to the higher-ups at the Bright Republic. Perhaps the Bright Republic introduced the Fusion Cup for reasons other than allowing mech designers to gain some fame alongside pilots. This implied the Republic was desperate to steal new technologies, which was ridiculous. Though it only ranked as a minor star country, it still possessed unimaginable wealth compared to most corporations. The income they made off Bentheim and the budding mech industry there ensured they possessed the resources to enhance their tech base. There must be something else behind the Fusion Cup. Something I can't see yet. In any case, nothing VES figured out could change the situation in the arena. The shielded skirmisher came quite close and only failed to reach the Kirby due to the kinetic force of the explosions pushed it back. Harg. What does it take to crack open your shell? Charlotte shouted in frustration as she slowly stepped her mech backwards while continuing to fire her cannons. She kept her laser mounts silent. The lasers inflicted negligible damage to the shields. It hurt her more than the enemy if she kept shooting to the point of overheating. When the skirmisher finally came close enough to engage in melee, Alexander patiently waited for another pair of shells to impact his dented but still intact shield. The moment the cannons fired off their payload and loaded another round, the shields dropped and a twin pair of heated knives entered the mech's hands. So that's what you were hiding. Charlotte yelled as she finally re-engaged her lasers. At this range, a barrage of shots created a couple of awful burn holes in her opponent's armor. Yet the lasers lacked the punching power to stop or hinder the skirmisher in any way. Mechs often used rapid-fire lasers to deal a great amount of constant damage in an efficient way, but such a narrow focus made them vulnerable to sudden strikes like the one Alexander performed. The skirmisher jumped in the air and landed both ends of its knives into the Kirby's shoulder mounts, instantly piercing them and rendering the lasers scrap. Too impatient to wait for her next shells to reload, Charlotte simply based her cannon tubes against the hanging skirmisher, successfully lodging it off her mech's frame. Unfortunately, the shock dealt some damage to the internal modules of the cannons, causing their reloading process to stop. Instead, Charlotte engaged her surprise. "See you, sucker." One of the 3 boxy rocket launchers started to flare as the boosters hidden within came to life. This was what Charlotte requested VES to incorporate. In her opinion, 3 rocket launchers mounted to her back was a little excessive. She'd rather replace one of them with some boosters angled in such a way that it could help her turn her mech around rapidly. Most heavy mechs turned like whales on land. Charlotte loved her new rocket launchers, but she was aware her opponents wouldn't obediently stand behind her and let the rockets launch at them with a smile. So she conceived of the creative idea of hollowing out one of the launchers and stuff some acceleration boosters in its place. As a pilot, she lacked the background to appreciate the challenges involved in such an operation, especially since they were short on time. Nevertheless, his budding jury-rigging skill worked full tilt in order to produce a solution that turned the impossible into something that might work. The operation had to finish swiftly in order to make it in time for this match. In record time, VES managed to hollow out the launcher, crudely using an advanced cutting and scraping tool to crudely scrape away the internal space. Then, he went to the pile of parts and dug up a pile of small, emergency boosters. Mech designers often mounted these one-use booster units on light or medium mechs to provide a one-time emergency boost or to launch a module outwards. Such boosters weren't designed to support a heavy mech's entire bulk. But if the Kirby borrowed the additional force produced by the boosters to turn faster, then they possessed just enough power to make the trouble worthwhile. Alexander responded quickly at the sudden turn of events. Before the Kirby could turn around and present its rockets at him, he used his superior speed to keep up with the rotation. The response came a little late. Charlotte already fired her middle launcher as soon as she caught him in her firing arc. Most of the rockets that launched failed to hit anything and miserably flew away to explode on the ground or against a security screen. A couple of rockets managed to catch the skirmisher in glancing blows. Their proximity detonations crumpled and damaged the mech's right arm, causing the poorly armed mech to drop a knife. The explosions also caused the skirmisher to lose its balance, an almost fatal consequence for a mech that relied on speed. "Take another round." Charlotte yelled with vicious glee as she activated her second and final rocket pod. The rockets flew out uncontrollably in multiple directions, a sign of poor and shoddy installation. Nevertheless, the inherent spread of the rockets helped Charlotte cast her net wider, causing the skirmisher to get hit near its waist, buckling a few armor plates and disturbing the engines that rested nearby. Right now, both mechs were at an impasse. Charlotte emptied her rockets and lost her lasers. She re-engaged her cannon arms and prayed her mech could reload them as fast as possible. Alexander on the other hand lost an arm and got some damage onto its armor. While he hadn't suffered a fatal hit, his mech was dangerously off balance and out of position to attempt another attack. He had to get close. It took a bit of time, but Alexander's mech passed by Charlotte's still loading weapon tubes. With a lunging stab, he struck the Kirby's head, successfully damaging and disabling its main sensors. The sudden strike caused Charlotte to flinch, but she retained enough sense to kick out with one of the Kirby's heavy leg. The medium mech's legs took a glancing blow, crunching aside armor and damaging a couple of sensitive knee components. Alexander tried to command his mech to pull out its knife and stab the Kirby again, but his mech lost its balance for just a tiny moment due to the damage. After switching over to the Kirby's chest-mounted backup sensors, Charlotte aimed again with her freshly reloaded cannon arms. She shot her left cannon as soon as the barrel tracked her opponent. The weapon fired just as the skirmisher's knife sliced into one of the Kirby's armor gaps. Shit! The explosive shell failed to detonate due to impacting within its minimum safety range. If the shell detonated its explosive payload at full strength, both the target and the Kirby would get hit by the blast radius. The Kirby's ammunition was significantly tuned down for this tournament, so the Kirby might have stayed safe, but the safety range remained unimpacted, which led to Charlotte's curse as she realized her mistake. The knife impacted the gap near the Kirby's left arm joint, which disabled the arm cannon. But before Alexander could pull out the weapon and retreat, Charlotte went berserk and knocked the Kirby's upper torso forward, causing it to fall in Alexander's direction. Still recovering from its previous attack, the skirmisher failed to disengage in time, causing it to get caught into the Kirby's falling momentum. No one spoke. Even VES stood with his mouth wide open. Everyone just watched as the skirmisher comically tried to wriggle its remaining limbs underneath the Kirby's prodigious weight. It was like watching a tiny mouse scurry from underneath the paw of a cat. Nothing worked. Charlotte could just keep rocking the Kirby's weight against her opponent to crush it into a pancake. The winners are Charlotte Hoffmeister and VES Larkinson. Their team has successfully advanced into the finals. An alarm went up as the referees activated several safeties. Thick robotic arms emerged from underneath the arena floor and lifted up the Kirby with difficulty. The people in charge obviously feared the Kirby might actually crush the thin medium mech's cockpit with its bulk. VES couldn't blame them. The skirmisher looked as if it sacrificed even the armor around the cockpit to get it to move so fast. As the pilots exited their cockpits, they all met at the center of the arena to shake each other's hands. "Congratulations on your win," Alexander haplessly said as he shook Charlotte's hand. "You caught me good with that fall. It would be reckless suicide to pull off such a stunt in a real battlefield, but in a duel situation I guess it worked out very well for you." Charlotte huffed at the excuse. "If it were up to me, those shells would have shredded your mech. Those safeties are bullshit. My Kirby can take the punishment." While the two pilots kept exchanging excuses, VES and Michael Dumont met each other a short distance away. "Great engineering. I don't know how you made those shields so durable in such a short time." Michael gave out a sullen smile. "It's just a trick. It can't compare to reaching the final round when you're ranked near the end." VES didn't like the mech designer's tone. He maintained his composure though. "I admit I'm lucky enough to be paired with a good pilot with an uncommon mech. Her heavy mech poses a lot of problems just by carrying so much stuff around. I know it put you in a tough position." The modesty only soured Michael's expression even further. "If this year's mech design competition hadn't switched to this bullshit Fusion Cup, then you'd be congratulating me. You're right in that you got lucky, punk. Your team beat mine fair and square, but if it came down to a showdown between just you and me, then I'd wipe the floor with you 99 times out of 100. If VES wasn't aware that quite a number of recorders were pointed in his direction, then he'd give the prick a piece of his mind. Instead, he kept up his smile and straight up turned his back at Michael, signaling that the conversation was over as far as he was concerned. "You should gracefully resign now while you can." Michael gave his parting shot. "Don't think you can overcome Edwin McKinney. He gained the qualifications to study in the new Robarth Empire for a reason. You can't imagine the depth of his knowledge." "Fair enough." The Kirby looked awfully wrecked, having lost both of its shoulder-mounted lasers while getting one of its arm cannons disabled as well. More troubling, the Kirby's abrupt fall at the end of the match left repercussions in the mech's internals. Mechs simply weren't built to fall like that with all their weight shifted into another direction. The organizers fortunately took their situation into account and gave VES a generous amount of time to fix up the Kirby as best he could. Shortly after they cleared the arena, the main tournament went back into swing. The quarterfinals and semifinals took quite a bit of time to complete. VES and Charlotte were scheduled to battle against Edwin and his partner's team just before the finals of the main event took place. "I don't know how strong Edwin will be, but even if it's inevitable that we lose, I'm not going down without a fight." Chapter 40, Finals. When the Kirby entered the workshop, VES looked grim at the amount of damage it sustained. The fragile shoulder laser mounts were total losses while the knife wound that disabled one of the arm cannons was very hard to fix. In addition, the overheating damage from the first match still plagued the mech's internals in addition to the abrupt fall that certainly knocked a few things loose. All in all, the Kirby could be fixed in a week. As it was, VES only had an hour or two at most before the Kirby was scheduled to enter the stage for the last time tonight. He glanced at the arena, where the top favorite of the newly instated Fusion Cup trounced his opponent handedly. The top pilot of the Cup, Christopher Young, happened to be the number 3 seed of the Young Tigers exhibition. Unfortunately for him, he got knocked out in the main tournament by getting matched against the predicted #1 mech pilot. Thus, everyone inferred that the YTE offered somewhat of a second chance for him to win an actual prize. His medium mech sported thick armor and a vicious loadout hated by arena-goers everywhere. His wrist-mounted flamethrowers and stubby shotgun-like heat projector turned his mech into the penultimate close-ranged striker. The damage his weapon caused might not be as overpowering as solid projectiles, but they had the nasty property of cooking the enemy inside his cockpit. In optimal circumstances, the striker tanked everything its opponent threw at them and simply blasted them with constant heat, leading to an inevitable victory when the enemy's machine practically looked like it took a dive inside a volcano. Such a mech was terrifying already in an arena environment, but VES cared more about Edwin McKinney. The prodigal son who returned from one of the biggest human superstates, VES really dreaded what he cooked up. From what he saw so far, the striker moved more fluently than he'd expected of such a well-armored mech, and he spotted no gaps at all in its defenses. Christopher's current opponent managed to test his mech a little bit, but not to the point of actually threatening Christopher's lead due to the damage he sustained in the previous match. Charlotte grunted at Christopher's indomitable performance. Christopher's an arrogant son of a bitch, but he has the accomplishments to back it up. He rose up to become one of this year's top graduates due to his own hard work. He overcame poverty and lack of training resources to beat a lot of other mech pilots who were born with a silver spoon in their mouths. VES could imagine how tough that was, being from the Larkinson family as well. Pilots in well-off families and organizations enjoyed specialized diets, personal mech simulators in your home and sometimes even private tutors instructing you from the ground up. The longer the match goes on, the more advantages Christopher accrues. We'll need to configure the Kirby in a way that will help end the match quickly. Tell it to me straight then. How's the arm? Can you fix the knife wound? After consulting a high-powered scanner, VES grimaced at the results. The knife dug in too deep. That heated knife cut through several essential cables and feeds. I can't fix it without dismantling the entire arm. It's better to dislodge the arm from the shoulder socket and stick another arm in its place. Obviously, Charlotte disliked the idea very much. The Turbofire sported a very specific set of arm cannons. The spare parts provided by the organizers didn't include a weapon arm of the same model. She'd have to get used to a different weapon or switch over to a fully fingered humanoid arm. What about the shoulder launchers? I can replace them with generic launchers. They don't have to be lasers either. When Alexander wrecked your laser mounts, his knives only penetrated the casing and inner components. They stopped piercing through after that, leaving the modular sockets intact. If you don't care about fast and accurate targeting, I can whip up a new pair of shoulder mounts for you in a rush, but don't expect a good performance. Charlotte considered her options for a moment. Do the shoulder mounts first. If you can, mount rockets or something else that packs a heavy punch. As you said, my only chance to win is if I punch Christopher first. Nodding, VES immediately went to work, selecting the same pair of rocket launcher mounts that he already mounted on the Kirby's shoulder. Due to the lack of time, he hadn't bothered replacing or refilling the back mount that turned into an improvised booster. This should still leave the Kirby with 5 rocket pods in total, which would wreck any mech at close range if fired upon successively. VES worked hard in accomplishing the job in time. Even as the main tournament caused plenty of mechs to get wrecked while crowds of fans shouted the names of their favorite pilots, VES fully concerned himself with bringing the Kirby back to a semblance of life. He poured as much of his emotions into the work as possible, hoping it could knock the presumptive champions off their thrones. What resulted from his hour-long frenzied tinkering was a heavy mech with 2 crude shoulder-mounted rocket launchers affixed to its shoulders. Unlike the streamlined laser mounts, the boxy, oversized rocket pods weighed the Kirby down significantly more. Together with the pods affixed to its back, the Kirby was dangerously top-heavy in its weight distribution. I can't do anything about the balance. VES warned Charlotte as he moved on to working on replacing the arm. You'll have to move carefully and never let yourself get tipped over. Right. I'll keep that in mind. The work on the arm proceeded even faster and shoddier than VES thought. He practically ripped the damaged cannon arm from the Kirby's shoulder socket, rendering it even more damaged, but VES hardly cared at the moment. He inspected the socket and hastily removed whatever debris remained. Then, he picked up a generic heavy mech arm from the pile of parts and hastily installed it in the empty shoulder cavity. Even as the semi-finals of the main tournament started to wrap up, VES hastily connected all the necessary cables without testing them to make sure they properly exchanged information and power to the empty arm. He skipped the fine-tuning and calibration of the arm entirely, which was a big taboo in his profession. An arm that wasn't tuned right felt like a crude prosthetic to a mech pilot. The responsiveness of the arm suffered greatly, but it couldn't be helped. The competition pushed VES into cutting pretty much every corner he could find. The announcer already got ready to warm the crowd up as VES asked Charlotte what weapon she wanted to wield for her new arm. And now, get ready for the final round of the Fusion Cup. Who will win the grand prize? Will it be the twin stars of the Bright Republic, the mighty Christopher Young and the genius Edwin McKinney? Or will the underdogs Charlotte Hoffmeister and VES Larkinson triumph once again with Lady Luck by their side? Granted, VES could give the announcer a prize for adeptly making the finals sound dead even. Whether the match resulted in a favorable outcome, nobody knew. VES didn't dare analyze his chances. Instead, he quickly gave the Kirby a heavy tower shield and sent it off to Charlotte. Both pilots entered their cockpits and entered the arena. After they stood on their designated positions, the security screens came to life, protecting the audience from the violence that was about to ensue. Commence. Christopher's striker sported the same loadout as the last match, which was an excellent decision on his team's part. Heavy mechs could be tough to peel apart, and a pilot as good as Charlotte wouldn't let an enemy come in close without paying for it, as she had proven in her first 2 matches. The first seconds of the match happened to everyone's expectations. Charlotte fired off her sole arm cannon while keeping her tower shield to the side for the moment. The cannon detonated squarely against Christopher's thick chest armor, but only managed to leave a lot of soot and a shallow crater behind. Charlotte waited for her cannon to reload and shot again at the same spot, managing to dig a little deeper. Oh, what's this? Christopher is nakedly provoking his opponent. He's not bothering to dodge at all. The naked arrogance in Christopher's heart came out in full display. The striker kept striding forward in a slow but constant pace. Each shell that exploded against its chest only managed to deal surface damage to the armor. The internals remained entirely unaffected. I've got more in store for you. Charlotte frustratingly yelled as she launched the rockets from her shoulders. She actually fired them a bit further than optimal, but perhaps she figured it was better to make her move before Christopher changed his pattern. The inaccurate but powerful rockets flew straight ahead, most hitting nothing but empty air or the arena's security screen. What rockets did hit Christopher's mech spread out their damage, leaving the machine a bit disheveled but still fully intact. VES gaped at the sight. It was one thing to treat a shield's armor, but to adjust the entire armor scheme of a mech in just half a day's time boggled the mind. This goes beyond the competence of a novice mech designer. Edwin's at least a journeyman in the standards of the Bright Republic. Perhaps he's even a master. This was the first time he truly felt he was a frog in a well. The galaxy possessed limitless wonder and countless treasures. Though it irked him to admit his current capabilities could not even touch Edwin's shadow, he was confident the mech designer system could pull him up to the standards of the bigger and wider galaxy in time. I wonder how the system is doing. It must be feeling a little cramped and lonely in my comm unit. Though Bentheim welcomed every visitor with a smile, VES was under no illusion that much of his actions were monitored. Perhaps he might not warrant personal attention from an actual human, but he was sure there were dozens or hundreds of automated programs tracking him from cameras, microphones, and countless other sensors. Only in the safety of his workshop where he meticulously controlled his own workspace did he truly feel safe in activating the system. Keeping my system locked in my comm unit is tempting fate. I should try and find a better solution to house the system once this ordeal is over. In any case, Christopher reached his optimal range. With one arm, he activated his flamethrower, and with the other he fired his stubby heat projector. Waves of visible and invisible heat combined with each other to crash against Charlotte's practically immobile frame. Much of the heat was absorbed by the shield, but due to its shoddy materials its forward-facing layers already started to melt. Christopher fired his weapons constantly from the same position, essentially battering the shield with heat. Charlotte kept up firing her soul cannon, only to slowly peel off the chest armor layer by layer at a snail's pace. It truly impressed the entire crowd how well Christopher's mech withstood the barrage. Seeing that her shells got dispersed without effort, Charlotte grunted in frustration and tried to charge forward. Unfortunately, the tower shield weighed down the Kirby too much, but even without the burden Christopher widened the distance with ease. It was perverse how Christopher's mech boasted armor almost as good as Charlotte's but with only a fraction of the weight. The match wound down as the Kirby suffered a slow death. Charlotte's ballistic cannon finally malfunctioned due to the internal damage it accrued by all the heat cooking the mech from the inside. It signaled the end of her chances of ever killing her opponent's mech. And we have a winner. The crowning champions of the Fusion Cup are Christopher Young and Edwin McKinney. Congratulations to Larkinson and Hoffmeister for putting up a valiant struggle. Please give it up for our hometown boy and girl. Perhaps admitting that this competition's balance was grossly out of whack, the audience clapped appreciatively at VES and Charlotte's efforts to fight to the very end. Somehow, VES felt most of his frustrations fade away. He got over the unfairness of competing against a prodigy who studied at an elite institution and using his advanced knowledge to his advantage. Second place is good enough, especially since I never intended to compete to the very top in the first place. From all the attention placed on him, VES felt optimistic he could find a customer in the crowd. While Edwin proved his overwhelming dominance in the local mech scene, he was too unapproachable. Everyone could guess he was meant for greater things. As someone who never left the Republic in his entire lifetime, VES put up a respectable fight, overcoming two opponents with luck and skill. Well, mostly skill. You didn't get to reach the finals if you lacked the qualifications to work as a proper mech designer. As the two teams met in the middle to shake each other's hands, the organizers set up an impromptu podium nearby. They waited for the announcer to finish his spiel so that they could accept their awards. So, can you give me a hint on how you made Christopher's mech so durable? The elite mech designer peered his eyes at VES as if he was an unworthy bug. Okay, so you don't want to talk, hee. VES awkwardly remarked, and discreetly pulled back. In contrast to his frosty conversation, his partner had an amiable conversation with Christopher. The young man wore a friendly smile as he explained the decisions he took in the battle, not that it required much effort on his part due to the overwhelming superiority of his mech. The announcer first awarded the third place to the team that lost to VES and Charlotte in the second round. Though Alexander and Michael's mech had been crushed by the Kirby's incredible weight, the operational capability of the mech remained intact, if a bit battered. Their opponents for the third place had lost against Christopher's devastating heat armament, which meant pretty much the entire mech was half-fried from the incredible heat. Repairing such damage when it spread out to the entire mech was a nightmare, and VES didn't begrudge the mech designer for losing. Michael Dumont did a decent job fixing up Alexander's skirmisher to the point where it could wield a rifle. And now for the winners of the silver medallion. Please welcome our young talents VES Larkinson and Charlotte Hoffmeister. A much louder applause met the two young graduates as they ascended the podium and accepted the silver medallion from the floating cases in front of them. With smiles plastered to their faces, they both waved cheerfully at the crowd. VES found it wasn't bad being appreciated for once. The celebration truly affected his mood for the better. In addition to receiving a commemorative medal to the first ever Fusion Cup held in the Republic, our two winners will also receive a cash prize of 200,000 credits each, along with preferable treatment akin to veteran status by the Bright Republic. The cash prize was a nice surprise, but it was a drop in the bucket considering the immense cost of business VES had to deal with. It also clearly dwarfed the prize money of last year's mech design competition. What surprised him was that the Republic actually handed out preferable treatment to the two of them. Even Charlotte perked up significantly when she heard the words. Normally, only the champions of Young Tiger's exhibition enjoyed preferable treatment. Damn, so I can strut around like a veteran now? She dreamingly asked. Veterans and other notables enjoyed many small benefits as payment for their many years of service. Every one of my classmates will have to give me the right of way. I can be among the first passengers to board a transit ship. I even get to pimp my mech if I enter the mech corps this year. VES cared little for such social courtesies. What he cared about more was that preferable treatment entitled him to looser regulations and more favorable treatment by the government in matters such as applying for permits or the right to manufacture live ammunition. Though VES wasn't about to run up to Cloudy Curtain's planetary government right now, he kept the details in mind for when he might need to expand his operations in the future. Naturally, VES wasn't actually a veteran, having contributed nothing to the Republic's defense. While the special treatment might impress the Hicks, the more distinguished people in the audience were hardly impressed. Any little bit helps. VES muttered to himself as he already scanned the audience for a potential customer. I don't believe no one's impressed by my work. His real struggle started now. With only half a month left before the bank demanded their $5 million credit interest payment, VES had to find a market for his mech. The Mark Antony wasn't going to sell by itself. Chapter 41, Sale. As the Fusion Cup came at an end, VES and Charlotte stood at the side of the arena. Despite their exalted status as second-place winners, hardly anyone paid attention to the two. The climax of the evening was about to start, as the two most talented new mech pilots ascended the main arena. The greatest show in the Bright Republic practically hammered in that the Fusion Cup was a side event in the end. No matter how impressive their winnings, they could expect to receive only 1% of the attention placed on the finalists of the main tournament. As VES was never a mech pilot, he was indifferent to chasing personal fame. He'd rather build up the reputation of his business in a more sustainable way. I've got some business to do. Oh. Charlotte raised her eyebrow. Bailing out on me, are you? I was planning to bring you out to a sweet place that makes the best spare ribs in town. I'm kind of in a time crunch. I've started an independent mech design studio and I'm practically buried in debt as a result. I was kind of hoping to canvass the audience and find a market for my product. Oh. I see. I heard you nerdy types like to pursue a career at the big companies. It's pretty brave of you to start out on your own. We all have different dreams. VES smiled ruefully. I know it's a tough road, but I don't regret stepping on it. I'm confident I can make it to the top someday. Wow. That's really impressive. Anyway, I won't distract you any further. Let's exchange contacts before you go. After they added each other to their contact lists, they separated. Charlotte headed over to her fellow pilots who congratulated her on her excellent showing. VES on the other hand made his way past the families and other regular people and headed up to the spectating area reserved for the first-class ticket holders who wanted to enjoy the exhibition without screaming children nearby. Security let him in without a fuss, a perk for being a participant. VES walked past an invisible screen that dampened most of the noise from the crowd down below. The dim lighting, luxurious upholstery, and the plentiful private viewing rooms gave the first-class area a sense of exclusivity. The people who possessed the qualifications to enter this area all emanated an air of class or martial might. Those present in the public areas all congregated into small groups of close-minded associates as they paid attention to the spectacle unfolding in the central arena. VES took a deep breath and made sure the silver medallion he just won was visible on his chest. Then, with a pleasant smile, he approached the nearest group of people who looked like they wouldn't totally shut out others. A trio of what looked like industrialists and a couple of mid-ranking mech corps officers took their eyes away from the tense and slow-paced duel to focus their attention on VES. Ah, you're the second-place winner of that side contest, aren't you? Are you related to the Larkinsons? VES nodded politely at the officer. My father's been on border patrol for many years, though recently he went missing. Everyone politely adopted a mourning expression, including VES. That's a shame. Those who guard our borders against the aliens are performing the highest duty for our nation. I'm still hopeful he'll live. VES shrugged, but resumed smiling, not wanting to tread down on this topic any further. In any case, I was hoping to interest you in a new mech variant I've recently developed for my startup business. One of the businessmen laughed politely. As a matter of fact, I'm here to do the same thing. I'm a representative of Jackson and Partners. We were just discussing the Mech Corps potential renewal of their oldest 400-unit fleet of Scout flyers. Well, that was awkward. They exchanged a little bit more before VES was politely sent off like he was a toddler intruding upon adults doing serious business. He hadn't expected instant success, so his first rejection shouldn't affect him so much. Still, he felt he was being disregarded by the people around him. His youth and lack of track record weighed him down more significantly than he thought. We only source our mechs from established suppliers. We signed fixed-service contracts with our long-term partners so they can offer the best support for our mech needs. I have to admit, for a last-gen mech your Mark Antony variant belongs to the middle-upper tier. Nevertheless, my core only runs current-gen models. We like getting our hands on the newest toys available in the market, you see. Your Mark Antony is only good for a decade or two at most before it becomes obsolete. I collect only the classics and only in their most original form. I have nothing against variants, but the base models are the best. This suspicion grew stronger as VES kept approaching different groups of people. Sometimes he got a chance to introduce his product before he was rejected, but most of the time they didn't bother hearing him out. Perhaps most of these people were genuinely unable or unauthorized to purchase a new mech, but for the rest it was simply a lack of confidence in his ability to deliver. Still, he got close a couple of times. Some retired mech pilots or veteran mercenaries expressed some interest in ordering his mech. Only a few things held them back. Our mercenary corps mostly goes out on extended patrols. While the short-term battle performance of your variant is impressive, we can't take it if it fails to keep up on our week-long patrol routes. We're actually in need of plugging a gap in our mech lineup, and if you offered us the original Caesar Augustus I'd be tempted. As it is, while your variant is affordable, even 2 of your mechs can't fulfill the role of a single well-armored mech. Your mech's offensive lineup is a little scattered. It inherits most of the disadvantages of the Caesar Augustus but comes without the base model's excellent armor. I'd rather buy a specialized mech that does one single job perfectly than a machine that purports to cover every area only to fail at most of them. He noticed that Carlos was off about his prediction that wealthy collectors were more likely to purchase his mechs. These collectors were highly discerning in their choice of mechs. They disdained cheap variants. Instead, they were more likely to chase after vintage base models or highly exclusive variants made with extraordinary materials. Wealthy mercenaries expressed the most interest in his product so far. They were open to purchasing a functional mech, but poked holes at the Mark Antony's weak points. The detriments outweighed the benefits even with the favorable pricing. Compared to the 65 million credit price tag of an official Augustus, the 24 million credits VES humbly asked for his product was a steal. Still, not everyone was willing to accept that bargain bin price point. A flamboyant mercenary who behaved more like a pirate than a legitimate mercenary laughed in V's face when he quoted the price. 24 million. 24 fucking million. I'd have to work my ass off for more than 5 years to earn back such an amount. How about giving me a break? Let's say, 12 million. VES was immune to awkward situations by now. He could maintain his smile even when the universe was ending. For an advance payment of 12 million credits, I can produce and deliver the mech to you within half a month. You can pay the other half once the MTA certifies my mech. Seeing that VES wasn't willing to bargain, the rowdy mercenary turned away. No thanks. I'm too short on cash. Even as the final match ended in a rousing last act, VES still hadn't achieved a single sale. He was beginning to grow a little nervous. This evening was the best and only opportunity he had to approach the rich and the strong. After this unofficial holiday ended, most of them would go back to their offices or mechs. By then, where could he find a buyer for his mech? Should he post an ad on the MTA's internal market and cross his fingers some chump picked up his offer out of the hundreds of thousands of alternative ones? He began to despair a little. He was so desperate, he'd get on his knees and beg if it increased his chances. The more he interacted with the people around him, the more he realized the mech market was more insular than he thought. The vibrant market the MTA portrayed did not apply to the situation on the ground. The MTA's market communities mostly encompassed entire star sectors. A single third-rate state such as the Bright Republic couldn't support too many producers. VES realized that by setting up his mech boutique in Cloudy Curtain, he'd inadvertently isolated himself from his clientele. A quiet environment, lack of competitors and favorable taxes meant nothing if VES was unable to earn any form of revenue in the coming weeks. He lacked too many things. Though he had a tenuous connection to the Larkinson family, they wouldn't go out on a limb to subsidize his business nor purchase his first mech. While they saved up a sizable amount of credits over the years, most of them were reserved for emergencies. Using them to save a failed business was not in the family's collective interests. Without the support of any substantial influence, VES was like a boat trapped in the middle of sea. Only a desolate expanse of water surrounded him in each direction. Where could he find an island to gain some respite? Whoa! VES almost jumped out of his skin from the abrupt greeting. He turned around to see the test pilot who piloted his mech during the qualifications. Hans. I didn't expect to see you here. I'm an active serviceman as well. Once I finished my duties, I thought I'd drop by and catch up to the finals. Sad to say I came too late. Anyway, what got you so down? VES explained his circumstances and then elaborated on his difficulties in pushing his new design. I'm not surprised no one's ever taken you on your offer. Besides the detriments you already mentioned, the most important reason why no one dares to accept an order is due to the untested nature of your design. Pilots like us, we don't trust the spec sheet produced by the MTA. It's been wrong plenty of times before and will continue to do so until they get their asses kicked out of their monopoly in mech management. As I was saying, we pilots like to look at the actual performance in the field instead of a bunch of abstract numbers that may have been fudged. The numbers are absolutely reliable. I've achieved a small amount of success selling virtual versions of my Mark Antony in Iron Spirit. So far, not a single customer returned to complain about any deviations from their mech's official performance. I advise you not to bring up these virtual games. Hans firmly advised. At our level, no one takes Iron Spirit seriously. The inaccuracy and deviance from actual piloting is more pronounced at the higher ranks of the game. It takes a lot of effort to adjust to two different environments, so most older mech pilots don't bother maintaining an active presence in Iron Spirit. What about you, then? You did a great job piloting my Drake through the gauntlet. Are you interested in a purchase? The test pilot shook his head. I don't earn enough to afford a personal mech, and since I test out new designs as a job, I don't pilot a fixed mech when I'm at work. VES received another disappointment. If even a mech pilot as friendly as Hans refused to buy his mech, then his chances of convincing other pilots was practically nil. I might know someone who could be persuaded to take a leap at your design. Hans added as he saw the crushed response in the young man. I'll do you a favor and introduce him to you. Whether you manage to close a deal with him will depend on your own efforts. A chance is all I ask for. I'm grateful for any assistance you provide. Hans leisurely led VES through the crowd of spectators paying attention to the elaborate award ceremony. The Young Tigers exhibition was specifically organized by the Republic to glorify young heroes, so a lot of fanfare accompanied the awarding of prizes. Once they arrived at the door of a private room, Hans knocked at it with a peculiar rhythm. A beep sounded out as the lock disengaged. As they entered the box, VES saw that almost nobody occupied the chairs and couches. Only the grandest seat supported a person. The man who sat on the chair looked like an old, gray-haired veteran that emanated the same vibe as his grandfather. Even from the entrance, VES could feel the man was more than just an average veteran. Ah, Captain Rodello, nice to see you again. I see you've brought a guest. Colonel, this is VES Larkinson, the runner-up of the Fusion Cup. VES, this is Colonel Aries Huntington. The retired colonel snorted at that. So the brat won a medal and a couple of perks. That's not a big deal compared to the young warriors on stage right now. He's not a pilot and I'm not here to bring him into your club. I just thought that since you have so much free time on your hands, you might be interested in what VES is selling. Oh. The colonel took a closer look at VES, actually taking him seriously this time. So what is it that demands my attention? It better be good. Knowing that he arrived at the best opportunity he could ever get this night, VES adopted a professional tone and explained the capabilities of his mech. Huntington's expression remained carefully neutral as VES elaborated on all the good and some of the not-so-good points of his mech. Perhaps revealing his own shortcomings wasn't the best idea, but he didn't want to risk getting blamed by the old man if he somehow caught on. Nevertheless, the colonel let him speak until he came at the end where he quoted his price. And so for the total package, with just 24 million bright credits, it's yours. After paying an advance payment of half the price, I'll get to work on the mech as soon as I get back to my workshop. I'll have it ready for you within 2 weeks. Aries grumbled a bit to himself as he stroked his chin. VES could tell he was wavering, but he couldn't determine what held the old man back from making the jump. Was it the armor? The lack of specialties? No. The old man finally replied after several minutes of consideration. You make for a compelling case, but it's not what I need right now. VES was devastated. He got so close to making a sale. Why did Aries turn away from his offer? The colonel insensitively waved them away. Captain Rodello, this was a nice distraction, but don't bring anyone irrelevant to me again. The two of you can go bother someone else now. I won't see you out. Goodbye. Chapter 42, Broker. Hans embarrassingly led VES away from the private room. Sorry about that. I thought he'd be more respectful. I've faced plenty of rejection before. It doesn't bother me to get turned away again. Although he said this, VES sighed with disappointment. I'm in an extremely difficult position if I can't find a customer for my mech. They both stayed silent for a moment before Hans thought up another idea. Why not enlist the services of a broker? I've already thought of it, he replied. But I need a large influx of cash within 2 weeks. If the broker takes his cut, I'm not sure I'm able to pay the bills that are due very soon. Oh, relax. I know a woman who might cut a deal with you. Anything's negotiable. You should really think about it since brokers know their clients best. Hans had a point. Many small-scale mech designers often relied on specialized brokers and dealers to manage their sales and customer support. These crafty salespeople spent a lot of effort building up a network of customers and other contacts. They trained their bargaining and negotiation skills to a terrifying level. To be fair, despite the substantial cut they took with each successful sale, they were an indispensable part of the mech industry. That was why VES allowed Hans to lead him all the way to the center, where a large crowd of well-dressed men exchanged their opinions about their favorite pilots of today's event. Marcella Bollinger. Over here. Oh hey Hans. A pudgy, dark-haired woman greeted the test pilot with a hug. How's work? Same old, same old. I'm not here to talk about my work. I'd like you to introduce you to an interesting fellow I met today. The woman raised her eyebrow and took an appraising look at VES. You're the Larkinson mech designer, aren't you? My, you're quite the big young man now. How's fame treating you? Not well since it isn't of much use in my current situation. VES shook his head. He found the woman to be more approachable than he thought. Hans told me that you're a mech broker. It happens that I have a new mech variant that I'd like to sell. Ah, so it's business this time, eh? Marcella's smile turned a little predatory. On account of Hans, I'll hear you out. Let's bring you somewhere quiet first. As they entered an empty private room, Marcella took a seat at a couch and patted her side. Take a seat, young man. Don't worry, I don't bite. Sitting so close to Marcella discomforted VES. Marcella's stocky frame underneath her prim and formal business suit hinted at a military or mercenary background. Though he couldn't detect the killer vibes from her amiable smile, he was certain that this woman had been through a lot. With his extensive knowledge and experience in mechanics, he sniffed out the presence of prosthetics in her right arm. Let's start from the beginning. What kind of business are you taking part in and why do you need my services? VES gave her the same story he told Colonel Aries. Since he couldn't hide things from a broker for long, he also mentioned his debt and interest payment situation. While giving out such sensitive information gave her a lot more negotiating power in any agreement they reached, it would prevent misunderstandings from happening in the beginning. VES was willing to give up a few percentages of profit if it meant building up a solid relationship based on trust. Any broker recommended by Hans shouldn't be too shady, he hoped. Okay, I see. Marcella tapped her manicured finger to her chin. Lay down the cost structure for me. A mech armored with HRF plating shouldn't carry an extravagant price. If I want to build the Mark Antony from the ground up, I need to use up 18 million credits worth of resources. The raw material cost of the HRF amounts to about 11 million, but I already received a stockpile of resources that's more than ample enough to armor a single unit. I can scrounge up the rest for about 7 million from the open market. That doesn't sound too bad, but you've left out your taxes, licensing costs, depreciation of your machines, and etc. Your real cost should be at least 50% higher. VES nodded to show his agreement at her remark. Those costs aren't relevant to me in the short term. I don't pay any further costs for my production licenses, and the taxes and other stuff can be taken care of at the end of the year. Right now I'm desperate for a quick infusion of cash so I can meet my impending interest payment on my massive debt. That's business for you. At least 90% of all mech designers who start their own businesses don't get to make it this far. Production licenses are ridiculously expensive to obtain if you don't have any backing. It's kind of impressive that you received 2 of them as grants. That puts you in the same starting point as designers with a fully original design in their hands. That alone makes it worthwhile for me to invest in you. VES looked hopeful at the positive remark. So you're willing to work with me? Yup. But don't get too cocky. I'm only in charge of the sales. I sell dozens of mechs each month, so I have no time to hold your hands. That's all I really need. I can take care of myself, don't worry. First, let's talk about accounting. You need to get that in order as soon as you have the time. I saw you got awarded privileged status. Make use of that today and contact your planet's tax office to get preferable rates applied to your business activities ASAP. Most tax offices tend to waver a bit and put up a couple of roadblocks if you aren't an actual veteran. Best get that out of the way first before you're handed a much larger than expected tax at the end of the year. VES nodded in understanding. Cloudy curtains in the middle of nowhere, so their taxes are already favorable to businesses. If I apply for preferable rates, my tax burden will probably not improve that much compared to doing business here in Bentheim. For a startup like you, every credit counts. You don't want to have a dispute with the planetary government this early in your career. If they want to, they can make your life hell. While VES was skeptical that such a thing would happen in Cloudy Curtain, he nevertheless took the advice seriously. Second, while it might be too early to talk about this, but you really should find a better supplier for your raw material needs. The MTA's internal market is only a bulletin board for resource providers to dump their excess and for mech designers to fill up a gap in their regular shipments of resources. The ready availability of most resources in the market is only made possible by overcharging them by as much as 20%. It's not easy for a startup to get suppliers to take you seriously. That's why I said it's something to consider. Later on. The open market should be fine for now, but keep in mind that you're needlessly throwing away about 2 million credits for each Mark Antony you produce. That debt problem could be history if you solve your wasteful sourcing. Marcella moved on as such a thorny problem couldn't be solved at this moment. As for your variant selling potential, I already have a handful of clients in mind. I'll warn you that without a track record, your new variant won't be able to demand much of a premium. Still, I can work some magic here. It helps that you designed your mech with some flair in mind. It looks almost as impressive as the genuine Caesar Augustus. What kind of price are you going to set? Marcella smirked at the question. It's not polite to pry too much into a broker's secret. Suffice to say, you'll earn your dues even after my commission is taken into account. I'm not going to like what I'm about to hear, am I right? She tapped her fingers on her comm and summoned a standard contract detailing a business relationship between a broker and an independent mech manufacturer. While I like you and you've got Hans to back you up, that's no reason for me to do charity. I run a business, you know. I have two little pipsqueaks back at home who I need to clothe and feed. VES turned on his comm and accepted the transfer. He opened the document and read over the details. His eyes practically popped out when he came across the sales commission Marcella demanded. 20% of gross profit. That's dash. That's a generous amount already if you consider how much work I have to put in to sell a niche last-gen mech with limited application. Is there any way you can give me a break? It's a little much. While I'm open to negotiation, I'm not budging on the remuneration. I'm also taking into account your sales volume. A small-scale mech boutique like yours won't be able to produce a lot of mechs annually. The scale of your business is really minuscule compared to my biggest clients. A one-man show can only take you so far, and that means I'm perfectly justified to demand a bigger piece of your pie. The huge amount of money Marcella skimmed off the top potentially dwarfed his debt burden. If Marcella sold his variant at the bottom price of 24 million credits, then he'd earn 7 million credits in gross profit, which was the difference between the sales price and the cost of goods to manufacture the mech. 20% of 7 million credits amounted to 1.4 million credits. If Marcella sold 3 more mechs, then she'd earn more than the bank. Hans, who stood quietly against the wall, gave out his opinion. 20% is harsh, but you can expect Marcella to treat you fairly. Unlike other brokers who represent as much as over 100 different mech manufacturers, she makes sure to represent your mechs with actual effort. Nodding, Marcella explained her stance. You're looking at the costs while neglecting the benefits. Sure, you can approach a public broker who will offer 10 or even 5% of gross profits, but what incentive do they have to raise their sales volume? If you sign a contract with me for 20%, you can be damn sure that I'll work my ass off to sell as much of your mechs as I can. Right now, you need to have a visible market presence and develop a reputation for your business more than you need to maximize profits. VES had to admit that Marcella sounded reasonable. Of course, maybe Hans and Marcella were conspiring together against him and took advantage of his desperation. Also, the commission you leave me is nothing compared to what you will get in return. I might not be the biggest name around town, but I have a lot of friends in high places. You'll be paying me for my extensive network that I've invested many millions in building up. A lot of other brokers might sell 100 mechs a month, but 99% of those mechs are bottom of the barrel. You can forget about earning the big bucks if you take your business to the budget brokers. The contract also states that you'll be my exclusive broker for 10 years. I don't recall this being a standard clause. Our business relationship is a two-way street. Marcella pointed out, gesturing her hand to VES and then to her. If you are prepared to invest in me, I'll do the same to you. The contract applies for 10 years because I don't want to do the hard work helping you build up a name in the market, only for you to bail out on me a couple of years from now and take your business elsewhere. As I said before, this isn't a bad thing. A 10-year exclusivity clause means that your interests align with mine. Think of how big your name will be 10 years from now, and think of who can make this all possible. In other words, helping Marcella was equivalent to helping himself down the road. VES understood the rationale, even if it left a bad taste in his mouth. What if Marcella neglected his products one day? He had very little recourse to force her to work her ass off if she focused on a shinier product from a competitor. Marcella's eyes sharpened as she noticed his wavering expression. I'll sweeten the pot for you. If you sign the contract this night, I'll guarantee you that I'll find a customer no later than 24 standard hours from now. I'll even hand you an advance of 7 million credits so you can purchase and take back the raw materials you still need to start building your mech. What if you can't find a customer within that time? Then it will take 2 days. Marcella shrugged nonchalantly. Trust a lady to know what she's doing. And what if it takes more time? Even if I fabricate the Mark Antony and let the MTA certify it within 2 weeks, if I don't have a buyer to take my product away, I'll be in big trouble with the bank. Could you help me out if they come knocking at my door? Sorry VES, but I already told you that you should take care of your own issues by yourself. I'm only responsible for sales. The advance payment is just a one-time bonus. And frankly, I don't mind seeing you sweat a bit. How else can I be assured you'll have a mech ready for me to sell within 2 weeks? VES suspected Marcella was fond of using monetary incentives to establish her business relationships. This is just the start of our partnership. If you don't trust me to keep my promises and do my job, then it's better if you look elsewhere. You have a point. VES admitted with a resigned sigh. They spent an hour hammering out a basic contract. VES even used some of his prize money to hire a legal expert on very short notice in order to make sure he wasn't being bamboozled. Sure, Marcella already screwed him up front. He only wanted to make sure she didn't screw him from behind at the same time. After VES, Marcella, and their legal representatives all agreed the contract looked okay, they signed it and sent it off to be notarized. Marcella received the full blueprint of the Mark Antony along with detailed specifications, or at least as much as the simulations could determine. She even demanded the right to manage his Iron Spirit designer account. Why would you need something like that? It helps if certain clients get to test drive your mech in the game. Don't misunderstand, they're not stupid or addicted to the game. While it's not an accurate representation, if they feel good about piloting a virtual mech that's about 90% similar to the real thing, they won't care about the 10% Iron Spirit unable to simulate. I guess you can also create some good promotional material for my mech. A visual example is very effective in generating initial interest in your product. We humans are primarily visual creatures after all. Watching a reasonable facsimile in action is a lot more visceral than extrapolating the performance of your mech from a dry spec sheet. After they exchanged a few more words, they finally called it a night. Marcella Bollinger left the exhibition center with a new cash cow under her belt, while VES still felt mixed about the contract he signed. He hardly bargained any additional benefits out of the bulldozer in action. He pretty much got run over during the entire conversation. He even felt it wasn't a bad thing getting taken advantage of. He reasoned that if Marcella wanted milked him dry, she'd have to put in an effort to squeeze a lot of value out of his work. Why am I imagining myself as a milk cow? Chapter 43, Miss Me, System. When VES returned to his hotel room, he faced two things. First, a cranky gem cat angrily yowled at him for neglecting his pet all day. Second, he received a notification from his bank account that Marcella sent him the 7 million advance for his material needs. Sleep can wait. VES said to himself as he activated a terminal and visited the Mech Trade Association's online market. He already took note of all the materials he required, so after a meticulous check he put all the items in his shopping list and confirmed his purchase. The 7 million bright credits vanished from his account like it never existed. At least I paid for express shipping. The goods should arrive by my doorstep by the time I exit from the shuttle. As he laid down on his bed, he reflected on the tumultuous events he experienced in his trip to Bentheim. In just 2 days, he put his name on the map by winning second place in a side tournament of the Young Tigers exhibition. While not as prestigious as the main event, it was nonetheless one of the best prizes a young mech designer could win in the Republic. Not only that, he enlisted the services of a well-established mech broker. With Marcella Bollinger taking care of selling his products here in Bentheim, VES could devote his full attention to fabricating his mechs and coming up with new designs. Still, the rip-off 20% commission she took out of his gross profit hurt his bottom line. Still, if she could ensure a steady volume of customers, the amount of profit he made over time could be a lot higher than if he wasted time selling the mechs in person. Maybe Marcella has a point. If I hire my own people, I can do my own thing and let my employees take care of all the annoying stuff. Naturally, that was something to consider once his business got up and going. For now, his mech boutique was so small-scale that any employee he hired now would just be sitting on his thumbs. After taking a long and deep sleep, VES woke up a little late. It barely left him time to shower and pack up his luggage. He was barely able to grab a quick sandwich before Captain Jillian hustled him together with the other contestants to the spaceport. This time, the crowd of mech pilots regarded him with a different attitude. Some looked impressed by his accomplishments. Others were puzzled why a talent like him settled down in the hinterlands of the Republic. In any case, VES knew he'd be stared at like this for quite a while. Of all the graduates who participated in the YTE, only he achieved the best results. The next best pilot only barely managed to scrape into the top 50. VES wanted to focus on his upcoming fabrication project, so he fobbed off most attempts by the mech pilots to spark up a friendship. It wasn't that he appreciated new friends, but he simply didn't have the time. Just after the shuttle flew up and escaped Bentheim's gravity, he was already pulling up his comm and making a detailed flowchart of his fabrication process. His slapdash way of fabrication might work with Iron Spirit's modern 3D printer and assembler, but his equipment in the real universe faced a lot more constraints. It might take only one wrong setting to ruin a component worth 1 million credits. So it paid to be prudent. He also applied for a production license of the Festive Cloud generator while he was at it. As one of the 2 only non-native components of the Mark Antony, VES couldn't produce it with the MTA's approval if he hadn't applied. Fortunately, as the component was more of a joke than anything else, VES only had to part with 100,000 credits to get a 10-year production license for the decorative part. His cash reserves instantly halved. The space shuttle leisurely fell behind a spacious queue towards their designated Lagrange point. The heavy traffic to and from Bentheim caused these Lagrange points to be congested, though that was only a relative term considering the vastness of space. Still, only a limited amount of ships were able to depart at the same time without disturbing the local spacetime too much, so each ship had to queue up and wait in line. When their turn finally came, everyone paused what they were doing and prepared for the FTL transition. The shuttle vibrated a little before the green light was given. No problems occurred when the passenger shuttle engaged its FTL drive. The return trip took longer to arrive back at Cloudy Curtain. Bentheim's favorable gravity currents allowed all ships traveling towards the port system to cut back on their traveling time. It provided no advantages when ships departed the system and traveled to a non-port system. Thus, it took about 1.5 very precious days off his timetable when the shuttle finally arrived at the edge of Cloudy Curtain's star system. The slow, in-system burn from the edge of the system to its interior took up some time as well. Everyone else just relaxed and ate their provided meals, visited the toilets or leaned back their seats in order to take a nap. Only VES was fidgeting while working on his planning. He went over the same scheme over and over until he forced himself to take a nap. When the shuttle finally reached the surface, VES thanked the heavens and disentangled himself from the others as fast as he could. With only a hasty goodbye to Captain Gillian, VES ordered a priority taxi and zipped back to the outskirts where his workshop beckoned him home. Home sweet home, VES said with relief. Lucky echoed his thoughts as he scurried all the way back to his favorite perch on his couch. Let's see if they delivered the goods already. VES spent a substantial amount of credits fast-tracking his material goods shipments from Bentheim directly to Cloudy Curtain. When he exited into his backyard and entered the cordoned-off area meant for aerial deliveries, he encountered 5 stacks of freshly containers. As he personally opened each container and confirmed its contents, he smiled for the first time in days. I've got everything I need now to begin fabrication. Marcella even sent him a brief message when he was still on the shuttle. She believed she found a customer for his variant, but the negotiations dragged on. The customer wanted to squeeze as much benefits he could out of his order, so Marcella wanted to slow things down in order to make it appear they weren't willing to go too low. Glad that the marketing was taken care of, VES was just about to start fabricating when he forgot about one very important detail. I haven't started up the Mech Designer system in almost a week. I wonder what it thinks about what I've experienced. At least it should give me a reward for taking second place in the Fusion Cup, right? Though not entirely sure, VES booted up the program resting peacefully in his calm with trepidation. He waited as the loading screen filled up and a familiar menu popped up. The system was back in action. Hey system. Did you miss me? Welcome user. You have 2 impending messages waiting for your perusal. Do you wish to display them? Yes. Gimme my rewards. VES already rubbed his hands thinking of all the goodies the system might reward him for his great performance. You have assembled an original mech design out of a selection of pre-prepared components. Design evaluation, Drake. Model name, Drake. Original manufacturer, VES Larkinson. Recommended role, Jump Trooper. Armor, B-. Carrying capacity, C. Aesthetics, C+. Endurance, C. Energy efficiency, E+. Flexibility, D. Spotting, C. Cost efficiency, A. Project involvement, 75%. Original component composition, 0%. Overall evaluation, a shoddy mech compared to genuine models, it nevertheless fulfilled its purpose. Put together out of standard pre-assembled components, the Drake is a remarkably cost-efficient if it is produced in a large scale. However, its lacking integrity and energy efficiency prevents this model from outperforming any other budget model. You have received 1,000 design points for completing an original design that has no other equivalent. 1,000 points. Besides the welcome package, it was the most generous reward the system had ever given him for a single objective. It also indicated that the system appreciated original designs more than variants. There isn't anything else. Your design does not fulfill the requirements to earn additional rewards. Please work more diligently in improving the core foundations of your next original design. In other words, the system disdained his cheap and trashy design. You know, I only had less than 1 day to whip up this mech, right? I did a decent job considering I was working with severely outdated parts. The system acted as if his words were passing clouds and continued on with the updates. You have received an event mission. Please check the missions page for the details. Event mission. Mission, Fusion Cup. Difficulty, A rank. Prerequisites, qualify for the Fusion Cup. The Fusion Cup is your first public stage where you can exhibit your talents as a mech designer. Do not cower from the challenges you face, but instead embrace them. A mech designer must be bold under pressure and fearless when performing in public. Crush your rivals and achieve a supreme result by winning first place. Reward, variable depending on your final rank. Congratulations for partially completing the event mission. A competent mech designer must maintain absolute confidence whilst simultaneously possess the capacity to self-reflect. Never waver in the face of defeat. Face the universe with your back held straight. VES chuckled as he realized the system gave this mission while he had just passed the qualifiers. Then he stopped his laugh when he realized the system kept tabs on him while he hadn't even executed the program in days. How was it able to observe his every movement in such an electronically well-guarded environment? The system quickly gave him the rewards for the mission he never knew he received before he completed it. VES treated it like dessert after a sumptuous dinner. For winning second place, you have received 500 design points. That's it. Please endeavor to work harder and never let yourself be overshadowed. VES almost broke out with curses. The system sure asked a lot out of him. He only used the system for 2.5 months. How much could he improve in so little time? Even with the help of the system, VES estimated he needed at least 2 or 3 years of active use of the system in order to catch up to the likes of Edwin McKinney. If he took into account that Edwin constantly improved as well, it might take 5 or 7 years. To become a star mech designer, VES had a long way to go. He not only had to shore up his fundamentals, he also had to build up his business and design market-viable mechs that not only took into account the performance of the mech, but also its cost efficiency. Designing and fabricating the Mark Antony was just the first step. The system already hinted at him that producing an original design was the road to real prosperity. Well, to design an original blueprint from the ground up requires a boatload of skills. And to improve my skills, I need DP, lots of DP. Eager to see how much DP he currently possessed, VES called up his status. Design points, 1632. Endurance, 0.7. Mechanics, apprentice, jury rigging 2, speed tuning I. Evaluation, on the cusp of breaking out of pure stupidity. The windfall of 1632 DP came as a timely surprise to VES. With such a large amount of DP, he could complete his purchase of several sub-skill upgrades that he had his eyes on that would help with his first fabrication project in the real universe. What also surprised him was that his endurance increased by 0.1 points. Well, it makes sense. I've been working my ass off for several long hours. I've learned to push my limits during the competition. With a sack of DP in his metaphorical hands, VES eagerly switched to the system's skill tree. A familiar holographic display lit up all around him, showing him thousands of all the possible skills and sub-skill he could acquire. He regarded the skill tree as his most important weapon towards overtaking the likes of Edwin McKinney and Patricia Schneider. No matter how fast they improved, they eventually had to put in the hard work to learn new theories and become proficient in new techniques. All VES had to do was earn a bunch of DP from designing and selling new mechs and invest them into the skill tree. Aside from the ever-elusive X Factor, VES had access to an unprecedented variety of new and exotic skills. Some of the more notable entries even threw his entire conception of mechs upside down. Biomechanical fusion, quad-pilot connected neural interfacing, permanent consciousness imprisonment. What are those crazy scientists up to? The more he glanced at the names, the more he felt as if the space outside the Bright Republic was a scary place. His sanity might have worsened if the system hadn't blurred the more specialized skills down the skill trees. For now, VES had no interest in taking up these exotic skills. Not only wouldn't he be able to explain how he became proficient in these exotic and restricted technologies, he also plainly lacked the luxury to waste his points in needless side projects. If he wanted to close the gap to his rivals, then he had to invest in his foundation skills, no matter how boring they sounded. Since I'm getting ready to fabricate the Mark Antony, I should shore up my assembler sub-skills. He purchased both Assembler Proficiency 2 and 3D Printer Proficiency 2 for 400 DP each. After having his DP reserve, VES received an influx of new information and knowledge from the depths of his brain. He realized he already knew most of the information coming to the front, he just hadn't realized how important they were and how it connected directly to his performance when utilizing the machines. He learned so many new tricks to improve the quality of his fabrication and how to reduce the occurrence and severity of faults. The flood of surfaced knowledge fully unfolded within his mind in a way that made it very difficult for him to forget it again. He advanced his proficiencies with the 3D printer and the assembler by at least a year of dedicated practice. This was valuable experience that already came into use as VES called up his detailed planning of the fabrication process and made some adjustments to his steps. After spending half an hour correcting a lot of tiny details, his confidence of successfully fabricating the Mark Antony without any major defects increased from 50% to 70%. Too bad it's not the 100% certainty that I wish for. My gear is just too bad. His increased proficiency couldn't overcome the limitations of his cheap, second-hand equipment. Though they cost several 100 million credits in total, VES regretfully lamented his father hadn't worked a little bit harder in procuring better quality equipment before he disappeared. Upgrading my gear is a priority for later, much like everything else on my plate. Chapter 44, Birth of a Mech. Remembering that Marcella hadn't gotten back to him about a customer, he called up her number. Hey VES. I know what you're calling for. The deal has just been completed. Marcella smirked as she said her next words. Guess how much credits he threw at me to order your mech? Did you manage to sell it at 24 million? Ha. That's chump change. It's much higher. 25. 26. Nope. Marcella gestured with her hands to bring up an invoice in the projector. Look for yourself what magic I achieved. His eyes practically bulged out as he saw that Marcella's customer ordered his mech for a whopping 28 million credits. The huge price figure amounted to a gross profit of 11 million credits if he delivered his mech in time and in good condition. It certainly raised his faith of Marcella's ability. Perhaps partnering with her was the best decision VES ever made. Marcella tapped her fingers onto her desk, snapping him out of his dreams. Don't get too excited, buddy. Running a mech business isn't a casual undertaking. You have to properly plan for your expenses. If you factor in your interest payments, your tax burden, your capital assets depreciation, then you'll find that your net profits is a lot smaller than you thought. The excitement in his eyes died down. She was right, of course. Well, my taxes will at least be lightened. The planetary government is already processing my preferable treatment status. I should be able to get my tax rate reduced to 15%. Such a low tax rate was very favorable to VES already. If he set up his business in Bentheim, then he'd have to fork out 35% even with preferable treatment. Your expenses and other burdens are lower than most other mech designers, but don't forget your business is a one-man show. Your scale can't compare to most small to medium enterprises that have based themselves in Bentheim for years. The industry revolves around a minimum amount of scale production. If you want to improve your mechs, you need better machines, and that means you have to start saving money now. VES nodded, understanding the importance of what she said. His 3D printer and assembler were good for a decade, maybe two if he stretched it and installed some upgrades, but eventually he wanted to move up to using more capable machines worth billions of credits. I've got so many things to spend my money on. VES lamented to himself. Earning a couple of billion credits was a pipe dream for most people. Even seasoned mech designers often despaired at the costs their businesses demanded. In any case, just do your work. I'll be expecting a satisfactory result within 10 days if you want to ship your mech to the client in time. Will you be able to make it in that time? He nodded with confidence. His planning stretched out the fabrication process to 9 days already, which was a lengthy time for an average mech. Considering it was his first time doing it for real, he wanted to slow down and produce each part with meticulous care. I'll have the mech delivered to the local branch of the MTA within 9 days for inspection if there's no problems. I don't expect any delays, but I doubt I'll get slowed down more than a day at most. Good, because a lot is riding on this deal. This is your chance to break into the market, VES, so nothing can go wrong. After a bit of lecturing by Marcella, she finally hung up, leaving VES free to begin his work. He pulled up his sleeves and checked his plans for the last time. Nothing appeared out of place. He had the materials, the equipment, and the time he needed to fashion his first mech into existence. Before he started, he took a deep breath and adjusted his mental state. He didn't want to deliver an average product and call it a day. He wanted to wow the client. And the way to do that is by incorporating something unique only to him into the mech. Even if most of the pilots of his mechs couldn't articulate the X factor, it would still help improve their impressions on his work. He approached the 3D printer with reverence. He loaded up the files of the valiant-looking Mark Antony. From its vapor-generated crest to its adorned and sturdy tower shield, the mech already radiated a sense of valor in its appearance. Its entire purpose of existence was to act as a vanguard, a breaker of blockades and a workhorse that could take a beating for the team. VES took inspiration of the mock-up and immersed himself into bringing this design to life. I am not building a mech. I am birthing it to life. Saying it mattered to VES. It sounded nonsensical or meaningless, but to someone who took a peek through the door that hid the incredible might of the X Factor, it was an important distinction that made all the difference in the end product. He was an artisan of mechs, not an industrialist who desired to pump out as many mechs as he wanted. To treat the mech as a living thing instead of a lifeless machine was the first step to realizing the X Factor. All right, I've got you fixed on my mind. He tapped the projection to separate the hologram into thousands of individual components. He started with the easiest, but also the most important part, the internal frame. The internal frame was mechanically simple to produce, but required high consistency in order to make it last for many years. Any hidden faults buried deep within its solid surface could lead to devastating consequences in the battlefield. The MTA posed strict requirements to the integrity of the internal frame, so VES could absolutely not afford to slack off when fabricating these seemingly simple piece of alloys. The 3D printer performed up to standard. VES had already checked and calibrated all of the important machines in his workshop long ago, but it was pleasant to see the machine slowly churn out frame after frame. VES took particular care when producing the sockets and joints that allowed the frame to move its limbs as natural as a human being. Only a couple of minor deviances emerged in their production, which was a sign the printer's precision was off, a particularly fatal flaw when producing tiny components like processors. It was a good thing VES left the entire day for further calibrations. With his enhanced knowledge of the 3D printer's workings, he dug into the advanced programming of the machine and ran a lot of tests and simulations. He narrowed down the source of the problem to a worn-down injector. VES solved the problem by fabricating a replacement before opening up the machine to replace the component in question. There. Now it should work as advertised. The rest of the internal frame components got produced without a hitch. Since night had already fallen, VES took a break and took care of his personal needs. The next day, he devoted his attention to crafting the HRF armor plating. It took 3 days to process the raw materials into a suitable form if VES aimed for consistency and precision. While most of the work was tedious and repetitive, he was constantly on guard for any deviations from the norm. A percentage less of a certain metal added to a process might ruin the entire batch. He refined tons of materials together into different materials, which got processed even further for up to 5 times. Each step transformed the main alloys from a worthless piece of junk to a less worthless piece of junk. By the time several days had gone past, the mixed materials had already transformed into smooth pieces of shaped plating. VES knocked his knuckles against the surface of a thick chest plate. It rang with the delightful tone of a uniform piece of metal. He spent a lot of time fashioning these plates, each into the appropriate form to clad the Mark Antony's outer layer. They still looked grayish-brown, the native color of HRF plating. He'd add some color later. The next 2 days he produced the other parts of the mech. The most important of which were the power reactor and the engines. His 3D printer had some trouble producing the most unique sections of those components, but VES was able to stave off any disasters due to his improved skills and his abundant experience in producing them already inside Iron Spirit. He only really paid attention to the challenging components, and produced the easier ones with a little bit more leisure, though he always made sure to double-check their integrity. Phew. They all came out okay. He only replaced a few sections with newly fabricated copies when his checks revealed a couple of hidden faults. Such suboptimal components wouldn't wreck a mech immediately, but it left the machine vulnerable to a cascade of malfunctions later on. Dealing with it now prevented the MTA from using it as a reason to disqualify his mech during their inspection. Now that he finished producing all of the parts, he moved on to the assembler. It was the tallest machine by far, reaching as high as any small office building downtown. While the assembler was a single set, the system was actually composed of many different lifters and hefty arms. They allowed a single person or an AI routine to put together a mech without relying on any other manpower. Modern assemblers formed the basis of today's boutique industries, allowing individual craftsmen to compete against giant mass producers economically. Though mass production always remained as the most cost and resource-efficient mode of production, small-scale manufacturers could tailor their individual products much better to their customers. Naturally, the huge transgalactic corporations hadn't sat still and incorporated assemblers in their own factories in order to offer the same customization capability, but it never really came close. In any case, VES owned a run-of-the-mill cheap assembler that wasn't in its prime condition anymore. Like his 3D printer, the assembler showed some signs of use and past repairs. Luckily, the assembler he possessed was not too advanced, so VES wasn't worried those self-made repairs would screw up the system. His checks also made sure the assembler remained in working condition. Damn, 6 days have gone by already. I only have 2 days to put my mech together. He could produce the entire Mark Antony inside Iron Spirit with that much time. Hopefully, once he got more familiar with his equipment, he'd speed up his production process to match his capabilities in the game. For now, slow and steady was the way to go. From a haphazard pile of components, the mech slowly came to life. VES started putting together its internal frame, which formed its skeleton. This was the simplest part of the assembly process, as the internal frame components were built as puzzle pieces that snapped into place with each other with natural ease. Once the skeleton was fixed into place, VES started to add the essential organs to the frame. The engines, power reactor, energy cells, sensors, and most importantly the cockpit were put into place one by one. They fit into their assigned places like obedient soldiers falling into parade. The trickiest segment of the assembly process came when VES installed the cabling. Though not as difficult as doing it for the Caesar Augustus, he sometimes had to resort to pushing or hammering certain sections in place. This is not supposed to happen at all. I guess it was wishful thinking for my 3D printer to produce all of the parts within tolerance. It might not be a big deal if part A came out of the printer half a millimeter thicker or so. But when parts C, F, J, Y, and more all exhibited variations in their dimensions, then they could cause a chain reaction of misalignment when he assembled them all together into one machine. Fortunately for VES, the deviations were within an acceptable range. Besides some squirming, he managed to fit the components decently together. Maybe it's not a bad thing this mech is not a carbon copy of its blueprint. The variations makes it unique. Just like each and every human is different from each other. Heartless fabricators detested deviations like this, but in the perspective of life, VES thought it was not a completely bad thing to keep some eccentricities. Naturally, it was one thing to be a little strange, but if you were born full of defects then VES would never be able to sell the mech. After making sure the components still worked at peak efficiency, VES moved on to the final touches. He placed the many pieces of armor in their designated positions. Countless robotic arms picked up pieces of plating and carefully aligned them before placing them together. Special screws and adhesives kept them in place. He also put together the mech's default armament, the mace and heavy tower shield. Assembling the latter was a tiresome ordeal due to the sheer amount of plates stacked into one single hole. All the components came into place near the end of his 2-day marathon. VES sighed in relief as he hit the button to let the painter module of the assembler go to work. He was way too tired to coat and paint the mech's outer layer by himself. Screwing up the coating mattered very little to him anyway. Once a few hours passed by, the advanced coating dried out rapidly, leaving the dark, intimidating form of a mech VES had spent many hours imagining its appearance. Having spent more than 8 days pouring his heart, focus and even love into its production, VES felt an unprecedented surge of pride and satisfaction well up deep inside of him. His dreams had come true. He fabricated a mech of his own design with his own 2 hands. His eyes welled up in tears as he admired the tall and armored mech's domineering contours. He refused to believe no one would remain unaffected when they came close to this mech for the first time. Since you're my firstborn son, you deserve a name that fits with your pedigree. I will call you Phoenix Cry. Naming the mech was a spur-of-the-moment decision from the upswell of emotions. He broke a taboo by giving it a personal name as a mech designer. Usually, the pilots named their mechs after a period of getting accustomed to each other. He hoped the client wouldn't mind too much and keep the name. Though the mech was technically complete and fully functional in its operations, VES wished to gift the mech one additional part. This extra addition was already in the blueprint, but he used a fake to substitute for the real deal. He used the assembler's mobile lift to reach to the mech's chest and opened up its cockpit. Lucky, who had been watching VES closely during his work these days, also followed him up. Plain curiosity sparkled within his lively eyes. The fresh and sterile interior of the cockpit unfolded in his sights. With a hop, he entered the cramped area and sat down on its specially designed synthetic cushioned seat. For a moment, VES imagined piloting the Phoenix Cry himself. With his head connected to the neural interface, he visualized screens coming to life around him as he piloted the mech through a fierce battle. He snapped out of it after a minute. I'm not a potentate. I'm never fated to battle in the front lines. The sorrow in his heart threatened to overcome his jubilation, but he managed to keep his negative emotions in check. His lack of piloting aptitude was an old regret. Instead, he put a hand in his pocket and retrieved a dark red carnelian. The gemstone's subtle gradient alluded to a lifelike drop of blood. It inspired a sense of vitality and passion. He could think of no better gem to crown his first creation. Lucky meowed at the sight of its old excretion, pawing at it with the playfulness of a child stirring around his plate of food. Do you recognize it? You crapped this out while you stayed in the hotel. If the cleaning staff hadn't alerted me to its presence, I might have missed this out. VES accumulated a nice stockpile of gems, but most of them provided marginal benefits at a very obscure magnitude. The gem Lucky excreted in Bentheim clearly outshined his previous droppings for reasons he wasn't sure. He hadn't fed Lucky with any notable minerals except what the hotel provided as an additional service. Perhaps the crowded, tech-filled environment excited the gem cat. In any case, the gem's attributes stood out in more than one way, and the color also matched the mech. With a couple of hand-sized tools, VES extracted the generic red stone in the middle of the dashboard that represented the mech's power button and placed the carnelian in its place, making sure to affix it securely in its fitting. After he finished, VES leaned back in the chair and admired how the lustrous gem attracted the eye. He inspected it yet again. Carnelian of focus. Increases the pilot's concentration by 0.1 when installed on a mech. The attribute was very special. Unlike the other gemstones Lucky dropped, this one improved the attributes of the pilot rather than the mech. How that worked, VES had no idea, but he knew the value of such a boost. Though not a game changer by any standard, it served to improve the pilot's impression of the Phoenix Cry while also giving him a minor edge which could prove useful in a tough battle. Furthermore, the gemstone's pilot-focused attribute also allowed VES to hide its benefits from the MTA. VES had no good way to explain how a mech was able to move 0.5% faster or could withstand lasers 1% better than the HRF plating was designed to take on. Before VES could acquire better skills that could camouflage such benefits, VES found it prudent to stick to subtle gemstones and keep the ones with material benefits for later use. Enough dreaming. It's time to ready this mech for sale. First up, I'll have to certify the Phoenix Cry. Chapter 45, Mech Trade Association. If anyone first heard the words Mech Trade Association, they'd assume it was a non-profit trade organization. They weren't wrong, but it deeply understates what a massive influence the transgalactic behemoth exerted in every corner of human space. They regulated the development, licensing, production, sale and disposal of mechs. Pretty much the entire life cycle of a mech was in their purview, and they sometimes came to blows in order to enforce their self-proclaimed rights. Even a small, tranquil planet like Cloudy Curtain possessed a local branch of the MTA. As even the Greater United Terran Confederation and the new Robarth Empire acknowledged the powerful organization's supervisory powers, a small third-rate state like the Bright Republic had nothing to say about the MTA's forceful presence within its borders. The association founded branches wherever there was a sizable population of people. Lots of people meant that at least a handful of them piloted mechs. If left alone, they could get up to trouble, so the MTA always made it a policy to supervise potentates even if they didn't own a mech. Frankly, the idea that an organization outside the control of any government entity was allowed to meddle in the mech industry shouldn't have existed. Countless conspiracy theories flew around in the galactic net that purported to be the truth. One popular notion suggested that the divisions in human space was all a sham. Every nation, from the lowest third-rate backwater to the grandest first-rate superpower, were actually different branches from the same tree. A so-called Shadow Council ruled humanity from behind the throne, and the MTA was merely its most visible arm. Another less radical theory suggested that the MTA was not as independent as everyone thought. Instead, it began as a secret joint venture by both the Terrans and the Rubarthans. Despite their intense rivalry towards each other, they shared enough common interests to regulate the mech industry and founded the MTA to bend the military strength of other nations to their will. The MTA's existence and its stringent enforcement of its principles brought the Wild West of the mech trade to its heel. They prevented the incorporation of weapons of mass destruction into the arsenal of mechs. They curbed widespread corporate espionage and gave smaller mech businesses a chance to thrive by encouraging the practice of licensing out non-cutting-edge designs. They brought so many benefits that not many people thought badly of the organization. What mattered the most to VES right now was the MTA's strict standards of public mech sales. Any mech traded in an open transaction was required to be certified by the MTA before they received a stamp of approval. Without this approval, a mech designer was deprived of an independent, trustworthy assessment of their product, which meant that basically no one dared to buy his mech. Naturally, such a practice was voluntary, and companies were free to sell their mechs without involving the MTA if they made their transactions private. This most often happened with next-gen cutting-edge designs between top enterprises and government entities. VES was too small a player to engage in such a high-level transaction, so he meekly submitted his mech to the MTA for their standard certification. Bringing Lucky over his shoulder, VES exited the transit shuttle and landed his feet onto the paved landing pad next to the MTA. He met the local supervisor of Cloudy Curtains branch of the association at the steps leading up to the complex. VES Larkinson. Ryan Baldwin. A dark-skinned man with a robust posture returned his handshake. Welcome to the MTA. When I heard a designer wanted to submit a newly fabricated mech in our branch, I had to admit we were at a loss for a moment. VES chuckled amiably at the remark. I'm the only mech manufacturer on this planet, right? Yup. The most we do is bust heads and lend a hand against pirates. We hardly have any mech technicians on site that are qualified to certify your mech. My apologies for inconveniencing you. Can the certification process still proceed? I'm kind of pressed for time. No worries, son. As long as we're not in the middle of nowhere, we always have a senior technician on hand. They entered the quiet and spacious building complex and went down the halls to a large workshop area. A cranky-looking middle-aged lady in coveralls greeted them with a stinky eye. VES, let me introduce you to Gertrude Samuelson. The woman in question crossed her arms. So you're the brat messing up my maintenance schedule. I had a system in place, you know. Now I have to waste precious hours off my schedule in order to knock your little toy around. Well, you better not think it's a done deal, because I'll be doing my best to dig up its flaws. He could only smile awkwardly at that. Fortunately, VES spent an excessive amount of time building up the Phoenix Cry. He was confident his mech could pass all but the most stringent of tests. Those top-level tests would never be applied to a regular commercial mech, so VES should be in the clear. He hoped. The three entered the cavernous workshop where a handful of mechs underwent routine maintenance. At the end of the stables rested the Phoenix Cry, freshly transported from his workshop. A couple of junior technicians already crawled around its chassis with several handheld instruments. Seeing as you're as young as shit, this must be your first certification, right? Yes, but I'm familiar with the steps. Good, then you know that you'll just have to stand there and do squat while I pick apart its flaws. Gertrude stated as she stepped behind a console and activated a thick, mechanical arm. VES recognized the device as an advanced sensor that was capable of penetrating through almost any material. The woman gently operated the arm and brought it over to the bottom foot of the mech. The projection in front of her changed into a cutout image of the section along with multiple technical readouts that VES barely understood. Looks fine so far. You haven't screwed up the proportions when you made the HRF armor plating. Lots of newbies trip themselves over when they work with such a highly refined material. A deviance of 0.1% at the start could get amplified by as much as 10% by the time the HRF is off the fabricators. I didn't rush the process. I'm confident the rest of my mech is equally as sturdy. We'll see about that. Gertrude diligently scanned over the mech, from bottom to top and back to bottom. She also swiveled the sensor from the sides and the rear of the mech as well, but to no avail. VES understood enough from the readouts that none of the armor or internal components showed any significant deviations from the blueprint. All of the flaws she detected so far was within tolerance according to the MTA's official guidelines. Only the most nitpicky of technicians would choose to make an issue out of those tiny problems. To her credit, Gertrude said nothing even if her frown grew deeper. Well, let's see if your internals perform as advertised. This was an area VES was less confident in. It was fairly easy to spot damage, but harder to determine if the components he fabricated performed on spec. As the technicians crawled away from the chassis, a young pilot entered the cockpit. VES, Ryan, and Gertrude watched at a healthy distance as the pilot activated the mech. The neural interface is starting up without a hitch. No issues encountered so far. The pilot reported, and Gertrude confirmed his observations through the readings that scrolled down her terminal. Startup finished. The mech is in standby mode. The power reactor is spinning. No leaks detected. Temperature is normal. Do you hear any weird noises? It's quiet so far. Want me to engage the engines? Hold up, I still want to test out its power management. Go run some power through the wrist-mounted laser cannons. Charge up its capacitors. Make sure the weapons remain safe before you do that though. VES watched on with Lucky as they both witnesses Gertrude trying to dig up faults. No matter how much she stressed the power system, she failed to make the mech squeal. VES increasingly grinned wider as he realized he had nothing to fear in this aspect. His mech was mechanically sound. Despite spending 2 hours testing out the internals, the MTA came up empty with regards to things to complain about. The engines purred like a kitten while its sensors were able to capture objects from kilometers away with razor accuracy. Let's move on to the active tests. The senior technician grumbled. The pilot took out the mech outside to a large and spacious range and obstacle course. Both weren't much to look at since the cloudy curtain branch only included them as an afterthought. Still, the minimum certification only required some basic tests for the Phoenix Cry. The first test involved testing the mech's limbs, in particular its articulation. Under the watchful eyes of several hovering sensors, the pilot stretched the limbs of the mech to the maximum angles possible. Nothing broke even when the arms almost bent straight backwards, which was a good sign for VES. The MTA then tested the mech's carrying capacity by picking up and carrying a variety of weights, which also went without a hitch. With these tests done, the pilot put the mech through its paces by jogging and then full-on sprinting on a race course. The medium mech pushed to its maximum projected speed and maintained it with only minor difficulties. The pilot then repeated the same track but this time carrying the mace and tower shield. The mech ran a lot slower this time, but the extra weights failed to topple the mech over or cause any other catastrophes. They then moved on to the trickiest part, the ranged weapons testing. Gertrude grinned savagely as she rubbed her palms. While she held little hope in finding fault with the shoulder-mounted missiles, the laser should be another story. Laser weapons contained plenty of tiny, delicate components, so they were also the weapons most prone to malfunction. They first tested the missile launchers, but everyone knew it was just a formality. The launchers were fairly low-tech to begin with as most of the advances in missile technology lay in the missiles themselves. The launchers only stored the missiles and kept them from exploding when they got bumped or something. Both the long-range and short-ranged missiles flew from the launchers without a hitch, and detonated against a cratered hill exactly as expected. The mech then moved on to a range, where it began to test out its wrist-mounted weapons at a variety of power levels. From the lowest setting, the pilot fired the weapon so rapidly that the beams appeared to be stuttering from an unstable power supply. Despite its shaky appearance, the lasers fired with the right amount of power and accuracy. The pilot then cranked up the power supplied to the cannons. The lasers increased in size and intensity. The beams flickered less but their burn duration increased. The maximum setting practically turned the laser cannons into bringers of doom. Thick beams that looked like flowing suns escaped from the barrel and bore a set of holes right through the targets on the range. At the end of the round of testing, Gertrude came out of the process with a list full of passed criteria. Without more stringent stress testing, she could not find any other opportunity to disqualify the mech. The pilot exited from the mech and jumped straight down, relying on the anti-gravity boosters in his mech suit to land as light as a feather. When the pilot reached the trio, he removed his helmet, revealing a face and skin tone almost the same as Ryan's. "How's the mech?" "It's an incredible mech, and I'm not talking about first-timers," the pilot enthusiastically replied. "I feel like I'm piloting a giant instead of a machine. The mech responds so smoothly I can't even believe it's possible for mechs to move that way." Ryan snorted at that. "That's the advanced internals of the mech at work. You've never piloted anything other than standard budget models, so I specifically brought you here to experience this new mech. Even with the difference of a generation, an advanced mech is still in a different league compared to the cheaper current gen models. You should try to get a chance to pilot the base model. The Caesar Augustus is a real beauty besides its impracticalities. So Gertrude, do I get your stamp of approval?" VES asked while the father and son pair talked about the details. "It's kind of suspicious how this mech held up so well during testing. Did you even produce this mech yourself?" Gertrude asked suspiciously. As if already expecting the question, VES shook his head and activated his comm he sent over his logs. "You can look for yourself to see I worked on it with no one else around to assist." She didn't even look at the logs. If VES was confident enough to send them over without a problem, then they really had nothing of note. "Very well. It is in my professional judgment that your Mark Antony variant mech has broken no rules and met all the criteria our organization has set for all publicly traded mechs. Your mech will be stamped with our seal of approval and you should receive the certificate in your mail in the next hour while I finalize my report. The resignation in the lady's tone barely registered to VES. He only felt an incredible amount of satisfaction and relief for surviving this ordeal. Now that the MTA officially certified his mech, no obstacle remained in the long road to selling his first mech. He immediately brought up his comm and called Marcella. Good news, M. My mech has just passed the MTA's certification. I'll send you the files as soon as they arrive. That's very good news. Marcella responded with a little more surprise than VES expected. Perhaps she hadn't been very confident in his first work. I'll arrange the express shipping on my end. The mech will arrive at Bentheim in 1.5 days. That's good. Can you transfer the payment over as soon as it's there? I feel as if the bank is already looming over my shoulder, ready to repossess all my assets. The credit transfer is already pending. As soon as my client receives the mech, the transfer will be approved. A heavy weight almost lifted off his shoulders. While the bank still gave him nightmares, VES at least breathed a little easier now that the deal was essentially done. So what's next on my plate? Have you found another client for the Mark Antony yet? Marcella shook her head. I've got a lot of other things on my plate, and I like to see if your first sale goes right before I find another buyer. I'd like to keep an eye on your current client for a couple of weeks to see if he has any complaints. If he finds no defects even after weeks of regular use, then I can confidently start pushing your product to my other clients. That's good. Still, after I pay my annual interest payment, I don't have enough capital left to produce another mech. I need another advance payment in order to start producing the next batch. That's not a bad thing for you, she said with a smile. You deserve a holiday, and more importantly, you need some time to get your books in order. I've seen way too many startups get into trouble with the tax office due to improper accounting. Don't rely on a random AI routine downloaded from the galactic net to do your numbers. Do it yourself or hire an accountant to do so. All right, I'll do it myself. My business is tiny and I only have one sale, so my books are very thin. Secondly, you should shore up your skills. I've seen what you did in Iron Spirit and I'm fairly impressed by the progression of your work. You've clearly improved in the short months since you first started designing mechs. Use some of the extra money you earned to get a bunch of virtual licenses and get to work expanding your repertoire. The only way a mech designer is able to advance is by pumping out new designs. I've never seen a mech designer improve by continuing to fabricate an old design. VES nodded in agreement. I already plan to sharpen my skills in the game when I'm not busy producing a real mech. It's a shame I won't be able to afford any production licenses. The Mark Antony will remain my sole product for quite some while. That's okay. You're still in your first year. Just by owning the licenses you already have, you're way ahead to almost any other mech designer without any backing. If your product pans out, you can expect plenty of sales from my end, more than enough to pay off your debts and upgrade your assets. That's the power of a good product. And what if the market doesn't catch on? Then go back to the drawing board. Don't get too attached to your first design. It's merely your first and most primitive work. If it's not a winner, then improve your skills and design a new mech that fulfills the demands of the market. All right, I've got a good idea on my coming schedule. I'll be waiting for the money. They said goodbye to each other before terminating the comm. VES already felt liberating from his concerns. Once he received the money, he could pay off his debt and leave enough of a surplus to leave him swimming in cash. He could do so many things with such an amount of money. Should he go back to Iron Spirit and use the cash to buy some new licenses to play with? How much should he spend? VES already looked forward to playing with some new toys. Chapter 46, New Perspective. VES personally watched on as the shipping company Marcella contracted brought the Phoenix Cry away. The loaders and bots carefully loaded the dark and red-coated mech into a sealed and padded mech container. They carried it back to the spaceport and loaded it onto the next transport out to Bentheim. With that out of the way, VES returned to his workshop with Lucky. The cat enjoyed the time out, but now appeared to laze away for the rest of the day. You're such a lazy bones. The cat drowsily meowed at him, not really paying attention to his words. VES scratched the gem cat's chin before sinking down into his couch. Before VES got back to work, he wanted to rest a bit and recover from his high-intensity fabrication spree. He found it exhausting to constantly pay attention to his emotional mood when he shaped the Phoenix Cry. While he thought his mech successfully radiated the kind of aura similar to the best mechs he saw in Bentheim, it still remained to be seen if it generated more sales. The X factor couldn't be measured after all, so on paper his mech appeared worse than it actually performed. I can still do it once in a while, but not if I'm fabricating mechs each and every day. Even with the system, VES remained immortal. Unless he spent a shipload of DP on his concentration and endurance attributes, he doubted the exhaustion would go away. It's more important to shore up my skills instead of spending them on my attributes. While VES recognized that both options had their merits, the skills provided immediate tangible benefits. In this early stage where he was still on the brink of bankruptcy after one bad spell, he needed. Oh well, I'll think about it tomorrow. He took the rest of the day off. He avoided all activities pertaining mechs. Considering that he spent most of his life with mechs one way or another, he found it difficult to find something else to do. He ended up watching broadcasts until he slept through the night. In the meantime, at a mech yard in the outskirts of Durham, Marcella stood by with another person as they watched a drone drop off a mech container. Both of them looked proper and energetic. While Marcella wore her customary green formal clothes, the men besides her dressed a bit more flamboyantly. There it is, Captain Carruthers. Your new mech. The Phoenix Cry, the very first model of its kind in production. The men grunted with anticipation. When you told me you were prepared to sell me a mech with my criteria, I couldn't believe it. There's not a lot of advanced mechs available in the local market that's viable at range and up close, especially within my price range. The wholesale armor replacement my boy has done to your mech is the reason why it's so affordable. Don't get carried away thinking you're piloting a real Caesar Augustus. I'm confident in my skills. I've taken the model out for a spin plenty of times in the simulations. I know how far I can push this mech. As long as I don't hunt after the most notorious pirates, I'll be fine. The alternative armor is also cheaper to replace. You won't be breaking the bank with this mech as long as you don't let its core be damaged. Some of Marcella's drones flew up to unseal the container and check if its contents matched the manifest. When everything checked out, the container opened to reveal a formidable-looking mech. The drones started removing the seals that kept the mech inert and its weapons cold. Wow. Playing around with virtual toys is one thing, seeing the real deal is another. Even Marcella looked impressed. Both of them spent hours poring over the spec sheet and the simulations of the Mark Antony. While recognizing the model's inherent flaws, they both admired its decent build quality and plethora of options. Marcella saw the potential in VES with this polished design, so she made sure to get her hooks in early before some other competitor got their claws on him. Despite her good impressions of V's first work, she only regarded it as a transient design, something to get the mech designer's business running. Even Captain Carruthers reserved some of his judgment on his new purchase. His bounty hunting outfit needed a frontliner, but not something that was helpless at range. While durability was important, he valued greater choice in offensive options more as he cross-trained in both melee and ranged weaponry. Finding a model in the market that paid equal attention to both was not difficult, but finding one that could take a beating and not cost a fortune was a challenge. He only settled on the Mark Antony due to a lack of alternatives. When the pair both came closer, their awe increased. The mech managed to put out a pressure that was not inferior to the hand-built Caesar Augustus that Bosworth's proudly put on display. The dark tones of the mech darkened the bright day somehow. Its gold accents gave the mech a sense of class, while the red highlights along with its dark red tower shield gave it a martial presence. The mech practically exuded battle lust despite its deactivated state. I see what everyone means when they say that handmade mechs have their charm. I can see why the mech designer couldn't resist giving it a name. The Phoenix Cry, it's not bad, and it certainly fits. The mech designer won second place in this year's YTE. He might be young, but he has already shown he's a cut above the rest. You can't find a design with this much drive from an established mech manufacturer. The captain whistled in appreciation. The more he looked at the Phoenix Cry, the more he felt he lucked out. Before we arrived, I found myself doubting whether I should have bought a reliable mass-produced model instead, but not anymore. This doesn't look like it came from the hands of a new mech designer. Marcella brought up the mech certificate and passed it to her client. The MTA agrees as well. They put in hardly any complaints, and what they did note is well within limits. The mech designer took his time, but he delivered a solid product. I'm itching to take this mech for a spin. Be my guest. Here's the keys and codes. The captain took a lifter that took him up to the cockpit. He pressed a button on his key device that signaled the cockpit's locking mechanism. After receiving a valid signal, the mech's chest parted just enough to allow the cockpit to open up a hatch. The captain squeezed through the tight fit and took a seat with practiced ease. He admired the cockpit for a moment, still giddy at the thought of owning such an impressive-looking mech. The interior of the cockpit matched the grandeur befitting of a Caesar Augustus, though instead of majestic white the interior was mostly dyed in dark gray and gold. The only splash of red in the cockpit was the prominent button that booted up the mech. Carruthers hovered a finger over the lustrous gem. He took in the luxury of it all. Impressed, the designer kept up the luxury even as he charged half the price of the authentic base model. It didn't quite fit, but that hardly mattered to him. It gave him some bragging rights when he showed the mech off to his friends. The sheen of a gold plate shone just beneath the front console. Carruthers bent down in order to read the engraved words. CA 1C Mark Antony. Designed solely by VES Larkinson. Hand fabricated solely by VES Larkinson. Made in the Bright Republic. Production number 1. The plate added to the handmade feel of the mech. Carruthers chuckled at the sight. He got too used to seeing cheaply stamped plates recycled out of scrap in his previous mechs. The cheap mass-produced mechs he piloted so far all tried to cut whatever corners they could in order to save costs. Forget about gold, sometimes the plates were made out of the cheapest synthetics. Carruthers stopped fooling around and pressed his fingers softly at the matte but eye-catching gem. The mech hummed as its power reactor and engines came to life. The cockpit's illumination turned to life even as the neural interface engaged a connection with the occupants' brains. The transition from a human body to a mech stature should be highly familiar to the bounty hunter. Yet as he felt his mind sink into the mech, he encountered a depth that was deeper than any other machine he connected to before. The Phoenix cry eagerly sucked in his mental awareness and gave it access to its deepest corners. A wash of sensations flowed over his mind as he became accustomed to the new perspective. Piloting the mech in the virtual simulations only impressed him mildly. But from how deep and rich he established his connection just now, he became aware that the Phoenix cry. It's almost as if I'm connecting with a kindred mind instead of a soulless machine. He discarded the notion as soon as it popped up. Mechs couldn't think, let alone influence his thoughts. The spec sheet clearly stated the mech hosted no AIs in its memory banks. The neural interface also passed the MTA's stringent tests, so his observations were not clouded by contamination. Carruthers threw away all superfluous thoughts and finished up the booting process. He then took his mech out of the container. Each step thundered the ground, enough that Marcella found herself forced back. The mech turned around and took up the mace and shield hanging on a rack. The heavy tower shield felt solid to him. It would serve him well as disposable protective cover. The mace on the other hand was clearly subpar. Made out of HRF, the only thing the weapon had going for it was its weighty head and its low cost if he broke it. Nevertheless, he decided to replace it with one of his spare swords as soon as possible. Marcella, you don't mind me using the yard for a bit, right? He asked over his comm. Feel free to push your mech. Carruthers eagerly moved around with his mech. He tested the Phoenix cry by running and testing out its weapons. The laser cannons worked like a charm, and though he hadn't filled his shoulder launchers with missiles, he was certain nothing could go wrong with them. As for the mace, it functioned fine as a blunt force weapon, but since he was going to discard it anyway, he spent most of his time elsewhere. What impressed him the most was the shield. Thick, heavy but incredibly solid and durable, wielding the tower shield gave him a sense of valor. He could already imagine himself wielding this shield on the battlefield, charging forward to meet the enemy head-on. While the HRF plating that made up the shield would peel fairly easily, he could easily commission a replacement if necessary. This is a mech made with the wallet in mind. The cost-effectiveness of the Mark Antony made it into one of the cheaper advanced mechs available on the market today. Though the mech's advanced components were decades old, they still performed competitively against the models out today. In any case, the bounty hunting business had a tendency to wreck mechs long before they got too old to remain viable on the battlefield. The bounty hunter exited the cockpit with a lingering desire to hang around longer. Still, he had some paperwork to go through before he could officially take up ownership of the mech. "So how is it? Does it meet your expectations?" Marcella asked him with a smile. "That, and more. The only thing it misses is my coat of arms on its chest. I'm sure you will become the envy of your social circle when you show off your new purchase. We'll see. I'm itching to test this baby out in the field." As both sides noted no problems, they went through with the formalities. After signing a bunch of documents, Captain Carruthers officially owned the first mech produced by a young talent. He certainly knew that more than a couple of people might take interest in the mech's performance. Let them peek. I'll be sure to bring out the full strength of my Phoenix cry. Just as Marcella sent out her approval for the money transfer, VES sat behind his terminal going over his numbers. His comm beeped loudly, interrupting him from filling out his ledger. He looked his comm and it stated that he received a notification from his bank. He stared at the message for a solid minute. His account gained about 19 million bright credits from the latest transfer. I'm rich. VES burst out as he laughed at the sky. Marcella actually did it. My mech sold for 28 million credits. He received an advance of 7 million credits when he contracted Marcella to be his broker, which he spent on buying the raw materials to fabricate his internals. As for the armor, VES used the stockpile gifted to him by the system for completing the 4th tutorial. This allowed him to skip the 11 million credits required to buy all the goods necessary to refine the HRF armor plating. His monetary gain therefore amounted to 19 million bright credits this time. For his subsequent productions, he had to put in 18 million credits to fabricate a new mech, which cut down on his profits. No more freebies from the system this time. In any case, as VES was already working on his accounting, he inputted his latest earnings and put his balance sheet in order. The mech cost 18 million to produce but sold for 28 million, which amounted to a gross profit of 10 million credits. Marcella skimmed 2 million credits from that figure already, so that left VES with 19 million credits in cash. The first thing he did was to transfer away 5 million credits to the bank. With only little more than 2 days left for the deadline to pass, VES finally breathed easier once the enormous pressure from the bank disappeared. As soon as the bank returned a message to him that his obligations for the year had been met, he whooped again, waking Lucky from his nap. "Haha, this is good news, Lucky. We're not going to be kicked out on the streets." Lucky meowed disinterestedly. "I'll also be able to afford shinier minerals for you to snack on." That caught the gem cat's attention. Lucky immediately jumped from the couch and acted cute by rubbing its body against his legs. After a short hug, VES went back to his financial statement. Unfortunately, not all of the numbers he got resulted in good news. From the 14 million credits that remained, VES lacked the necessary funds required to produce another Mark Antony independently. He still remained dependent on Marcella's services, specifically her ability to demand a down payment from her buyers to fund the production of their new mechs. I hope she won't have too much trouble with this condition. Furthermore, if VES wanted to budget his money responsibly, he should reserve some of his cash and put it into his piggy bank for future needs. Considering his looming financial burden, paying back the 350 million credits he owed the bank was a minor priority. His perspectives already changed after his first transaction. Now that he showed off his ability to run a viable business, the bank should be easing off on him as well. The debt his father took on his behalf was not an entirely bad thing for the bank. They earned an easy amount of interest from his business each year, and as long as VES didn't screw up, the money loaned was put to good use in the bank's perspective. Considering that he could earn an average profit of 8 million credits each time Marcella sold his mech, the threat the annual interest payments posed to VES diminished greatly. The problem essentially changed from an angry elephant into a harmless mouse. He could squash the mouse whenever he wanted, but it was a bit troublesome to do so and required a bit of effort on his part. Rather than waste his time stomping the floor or setting up traps, he could let the mouse scurry around his pantry and steal a bit of his cheese from time to time. What VES was more concerned about was something that plagued every single business in the tech sector: planned obsolescence. Part 5 of the series ends here. Thank you for watching and listening. If you find it interesting, please give us a like, a comment and a subscription so that we have the motivation to make the next videos.